$20. That was the price a drunken gambler put on Clara Whitfield's life, slapping her wrist onto the bar like she was a sack of grain nobody wanted. Ethan Calloway had sworn off saving anyone. He believed people who reached for others always ended up buried by winter. But when Clara lifted her bruised face and asked for nothing, not rescue, not pity, only her daughter's name, something frozen inside him cracked open. He didn't know it yet, but the true price of that $20 hadn't even been named. If stories of broken hearts finding healing in the untamed West speak to something in you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now and stay with me all the way to the end. I promise you, it's worth it. And tell me down in the comments what city you're watching from tonight, so I can see just how far Ethan and Clara's story has traveled. The door of the Black Hollow Saloon slammed open hard enough to rattle the lantern glass, and the wind that came in with it smelled like snow and blood. Ethan Calloway didn't look up right away. He never did. A man who looked up too fast in a room like this was a man announcing he had something worth taking. So, he kept his eyes on the whiskey. He hadn't touched his hat brim, low, his back to the wall, the way it had been for 20 years of rooms just like it. But the room went quiet in a way that made the hair on his arm stand up. Not the quiet of respect, the quiet of men watching something ugly and deciding not to stop it. "Please," a woman's voice said. Thin, cracked down the middle like river ice in March. "Please, Caleb, don't do this." Ethan's eyes came up. A man he recognized, Caleb Mercer, a gambler who owed money to half the territory and courage to none of it, had a fistful of a woman's wrist and was dragging her toward the bar the way a man drags a mule that won't walk. Her dress had been beige once, maybe blue. It was hard to tell under the mud and the tears in the fabric. Her hair had come loose from its pins and hung in front of a face that had a fresh bruise blooming purple along the cheekbone, old enough to have started yellowing at the edges, fresh enough to still be swelling. "Shut your mouth, Clara," Caleb said, and there wasn't a drop of shame in his voice. Only the flat, ugly desperation of a man who'd run out of every other option and had decided somewhere between his last card and this moment that she wasn't a person anymore. She was collateral. Ethan set his glass down without drinking from it. Around the room, men who called themselves neighbors, men who tipped their hats to their own wives on Sunday, sat and watched with the particular stillness of an audience that has decided entertainment is coming and doesn't want to miss it. "I owe Doss $200, Caleb said to the room loud, like he was announcing a horse for sale. "I got $11 and a debt that follows me to the grave if I don't settle it tonight." He shoved Clara forward so she stumbled against the bar rail, catching herself with both hands, her knuckles white. "She cooks, she sews, she don't talk back much, not no more." He laughed short and bitter. "She's worth $20 to any man who wants a wife without the courting." "I am not yours to sell," Clara said. Her voice shook, but it didn't break. Ethan noticed that, filed it away without knowing why it mattered yet. "You stopped being your own the day your husband died and left you with nothing but debts," Caleb snapped. "Now hush." The barkeep, a heavy man named Otis, who had seen every kind of sin Black Hollow had to offer and stopped being surprised by most of them, wiped a glass and didn't meet anybody's eyes. That was the thing about towns like this. Nobody wanted to be the one who said something. Saying something meant becoming part of it. A man near the faro table, broad, red-faced, half a bottle deep, pushed back his chair. "I'll give 15 for her," he said, grinning at his friends like he'd made a fine joke. "She's a little worn, though. 15's fair." Laughter. Ugly, rolling laughter that filled the room like smoke. Clara's spine went rigid. She didn't look at the man who'd spoken. She looked at the floor at a spot just past her own feet. And Ethan understood in that instant that she had gone somewhere else inside her own head. Somewhere the laughter couldn't follow her. Because she had learned probably more than once that surviving this kind of moment meant leaving your body behind for other people to look at while the rest of you hid. He had seen that looks before. On men after Antietam. On men after they buried everyone they loved in a single winter. It was not the look of fear. It was the look of someone who had stopped believing anyone was coming. $20. Caleb said again, louder now, sensing the room's appetite. "And she's yours, free and clear. I got the marriage paper. My sister married her off proper to her husband, and now that fool's dead, she's under my charge. I can sign her right over." "That ain't legal and you know it," Otis muttered, but he didn't say it loud enough for anyone to have to answer to it. The red-faced man stood reaching for his coin purse. Ethan felt something in his chest move that he hadn't felt in longer than he could put a date to. Not anger exactly. Anger was too clean a word for it. It was closer to the feeling of watching a dam crack, a slow, terrible certainty that something was about to break loose that couldn't be put back. He had told himself for 20 years that the mountain was the only honest place left, that people ruined each other the second you let them close enough to try, and the only way to keep from being ruined was to keep them out. He had buried a wife and a son in ground so hard he'd had to burn a fire on it for 3 days before the shovel would go in, and after that he had decided the world could do what it wanted to itself. He would not be part of it. He would not watch it. He would live on his mountain with his rifle and his silence, and let the rest of humanity tear itself apart without him. He had held to that for 2 decades. He held to it for exactly 4 more seconds. Then he stood up. The chair scraped back loud in the quiet room, and every head turned because Ethan Calloway standing up in a room was not a small thing. He was a big man, built by axe and rifle, and 30 winters of hauling his own life up a mountainside, with a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, where a Comanche blade had come close to finishing him in 61. Men who didn't know him got quiet around him on instinct, the way animals go still around something bigger than themselves. He walked to the bar. He didn't hurry. He set 2 $10 gold pieces down on the wood hard enough that they rang. "She's coming with me," he said. The room went silent in a different way now. Not the eager, hungry silence from before. Something more careful, more uncertain. Caleb blinked at the coins, then at Ethan, calculating fast the way desperate men do. "Well now," he said, a greasy little smile finding its way onto his face. "The mountain man wants himself a wife after all these years. Didn't figure you for the type Calloway." "I didn't buy a wife," Ethan said, and his voice was low and even. The kind of voice that had ended arguments before by simply refusing to raise itself. "I bought her out of this room. What she does with her own life after that is her business, not mine, not yours, not anybody's in here who thinks a woman's worth what a room full of drunk men decides to bid." "Don't matter what you call it," Caleb said, sweeping the coins off the bar and into his vest pocket, like a man who'd just been handed salvation. "She's yours, papers and all. Do what you like with her." "I'll do nothing with her," Ethan said. "That's the point you're missing." He turned to Clara. Up close, the bruise on her cheek was worse than it had looked from across the room, and there was a cut above her eyebrow that had scabbed over without being cleaned properly. She was watching him now with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not gratitude, not yet. Not even relief. Something more guarded than that. Something that looked like she was waiting to find out what kind of trap this was, because in her experience, kindness usually came with a price tag too, and she was still trying to work out what his was. "Ma'am," Ethan said, and he took his hat off because his mother had raised him to take his hat off in front of a lady even in the middle of hell, and this felt like hell as much as anywhere he'd stood. "I'm not gonna hurt you. You don't have to come with me if you don't want to, but I don't reckon you got a whole lot of other doors open to you in this room tonight." Clara looked past him at the men still watching at Caleb counting his coins with the satisfied air of a man who'd solved a math problem, at the red-faced bidder settling back into his chair with a scowl like he'd been cheated out of a purchase. "No," she said quietly. "I don't." "Then let's go," Ethan said. "Storm's coming in before midnight. I'd rather not be caught in it." He didn't reach for her. He'd learned enough in that one long look at her face to know that reaching for her without asking would undo whatever thin thread of trust had just been strung between them. He simply turned and walked toward the door, and after a moment that felt longer than it was, he heard her footsteps behind him, careful and quick like a woman following a path she wasn't yet sure was solid ground. Outside, the cold hit like a slap, and the wind carried the first hard flecks of snow sideways across the street. Ethan's horse, a big raw-boned gray named Samson, stood tied at the post with his ears pinned back against the weather. "You got anything back there worth going back for?" Ethan asked, nodding toward the saloon. "Belongings. Anything." Clara shook her head. Her arms were wrapped around herself, and Ethan noticed with a discomfort he didn't examine too closely that she was flinching slightly every time his voice rose above a certain volume. The way a dog flinches at a raised hand, even after the hand has stopped hitting. "He took everything when my husband passed," she said. "Sold the wagon, sold the mule. Said it was owed to him for the trouble of taking me in." A short, humorless breath that might have been meant as a laugh. "I got the dress on my back, and that's the whole of it." "All right," Ethan said. He didn't say anything comforting, because he didn't have comforting words in him. He'd never needed them living alone the way he did, but he also didn't say anything that asked her to explain herself further, and something in her shoulders eased slightly at that. He swung up onto Samson and reached a hand down. She looked at the hand for a long moment. "I ain't gonna hurt you," Ethan said again, quieter this time. "Reckon you've heard that before from men who didn't mean it. I can't make you believe me tonight. I can only keep proving it tomorrow and the day after that till you do." Something shifted in her face. Not trust, not yet, but the decision to take a risk anyway, which Ethan would come to understand later was its own kind of courage, maybe a braver kind than trust itself. She took his hand. He pulled her up behind him onto the saddle, and she settled her hands lightly at his coat, not gripping, careful to keep a proper distance, even balanced on a moving horse in a rising storm. And Ethan turned Samson's head toward the mountain road and didn't look back at Black Hollow once. They rode in silence for the first hour, snow thickening around them, the wind picking up teeth. Ethan had ridden this trail in worse conditions, blind drunk and half frozen, and never once given it a second thought. But tonight, he found himself more aware of the woman behind him than of the storm, the way she'd stopped shivering after the first 20 minutes. Not because she'd warmed up, but because she'd simply decided not to show it. The way her breathing had gone steady and controlled like someone rationing herself. "You don't have to pretend you're not cold," he said, finally raising his voice over the wind. "Ain't nobody out here to perform for." "I'm not performing," Clara called back. "I'm surviving. There's a difference." That struck him harder than he expected. He didn't answer right away. They crossed the frozen creek at the low ford Samson, picking his way carefully over ice-slicked stone, and on the far bank the horse's back leg slid sideways on a patch of black ice, and for one heart-stopping second, the whole animal lurched, and Ethan felt Clara's weight shift with a speed and steadiness that surprised him. She didn't grab at him in panic, didn't scream, just leaned into the correction, like she'd ridden through 100 stumbling horses in her life, her hand flat and firm against his back for balance until Samson found his footing again. "You've ridden before," Ethan said, not quite a question. "My family raised horses before the war took the money out of everything," Clara said. "I know when to hold on and when to let a horse find its own feet. Panicking just makes them panic too." He filed that away as well. Another small correction to whatever picture he'd built of her in the 4 minutes since he'd first seen her dragged across a saloon floor. He had expected he could admit it to himself now, riding through the snow, with her steady weight behind him. He had expected someone who needed carrying. What he was finding instead was someone who had simply run out of places to stand. 2 hours later, half frozen and moving on. Will alone. They came up the last ridge to Ethan's cabin, a low, solid structure of hewn logs with smoke already gone cold in the chimney, tucked into a stand of pine that broke the worst of the wind. Ethan got the door open, got a fire started with the efficient economy of a man who'd done it 10,000 times, and only once the flame caught properly did he turn to look at Clara, standing just inside the doorway, snow melting in her hair, her arms still wrapped around herself, looking at the single room, the one bed against the wall. The table, the 2 chairs, the rifle rack, like she was trying to work out the geometry of a trap. "There's only the one bed," Ethan said before she could ask or assume. "You'll take it. I'll sleep by the fire. That's not a negotiation, that's just how it's gonna be." Clara's eyes came up to his, searching his face for something, a lie maybe, or the specific kind of tenderness that men sometimes used as a longer road to the same destination. "You don't have to do that," she said carefully, I know I don't have to, Ethan said. I'm choosing to. There's a difference, same as the one you told me about back on the trail. Something almost like the beginning of a smile touched the corner of her mouth before she caught it and put it away, like she wasn't sure yet whether she was allowed to have it. He busied himself at the stove, warming what was left of yesterday's stew, giving her time and space to take her own measure of the room of him, of the whole strange turn her night had taken. When he set a bowl in front of her at the table, she ate like a woman who'd learned not to trust that a second meal was coming fast and careful, watching him between bites. Ethan Calloway, he said, realizing he'd never properly given her his name. Folks around here mostly just call me Calloway, or don't call me anything at all on account of I don't come down off this mountain much. Clara, she said. Clara Whitfield. A pause. I don't know how to thank you for tonight. I don't rightly know what you want from me in return, and I'd rather you just tell me plain than let me spend the next week waiting to find out. I don't want anything from you, Ethan said. I didn't buy you Clara. I bought your safety out of that room, and now that debt's settled and done. Come morning, you're free to do whatever you please. Stay through the storm if you've got no place else, or if the weather breaks, I'll take you wherever you want to go. But you don't owe me nothing. Not your gratitude, not your company, not your... He stopped himself, aware of where the sentence had been about to land, and started again more carefully. Not anything, he finished. Clara set her spoon down. Later, when the fire had burned low, and Ethan had made up a pallet on the floor with a spare bedroll, he heard movement behind him and turned to find Clara standing beside the bed, with trembling hands at the buttons of her torn dress. Her face carefully blank in a way that told him more than tears would have. Clara. His voice came out rougher than he intended. What in God's name are you doing? I know how this works, she said, not looking at him. Her fingers still moving at the buttons with the mechanical steadiness of someone who had done this before and hated every second of it, and had simply learned that hating it didn't stop it from being required. You don't have to pretend with me, Mr. Calloway. I'm not a fool. Men don't buy women out of saloons for nothing. Stop. Ethan crossed the room in 3 strides and caught her hands, gently stilling them without gripping hard enough to bruise the skin that was already bruised in too many other places. Stop right now. Clara froze, her eyes finally lifting to his, and what he saw there wrecked something in him more thoroughly than the saloon had. Not fear of him exactly. Fear of herself. Fear of a world that had trained her so thoroughly to expect this, that kindness without a price attached had become a language she no longer recognized. I am not that kind of man, Ethan said, low and steady, holding her hand still, but not tight. And even if I was, I would not be that kind of man tonight with you in this condition after the night you've had. You hear me? Nobody in this cabin is owed anything from your body. Not me. Not tonight. Not ever. Clara's composure, the careful blankness she'd been holding since the saloon, cracked all at once, and she pulled her hands back from his and pressed them over her own face, and her shoulders began to shake with a silence that was somehow louder than screaming would have been. Ethan stood there, unsure what a man was supposed to do with a moment like this, having spent 20 years specifically arranging his life so he'd never have to know. He settled eventually for sitting down at the edge of the bed, a careful distance away, close enough to be present and far enough to not crowd her. I've been treated like property for 2 years, Clara said finally into her hands. Since my husband died, my brother-in-law took what was left of the ranch and told me I was part of the estate, same as the cattle. I stopped expecting different from anybody a long time ago. It's easier that way. Expecting different just gives you more to lose when it doesn't come. Well, Ethan said, you can go on expecting the worst if it's easier for you. But I'm telling you, plain under this roof, you're going to get treated like a person whether you're braced for it or not. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist, a rough, impatient gesture, like she was angry at her own tears for showing up uninvited. Why? She asked. Why'd you do it $20 for a stranger? You don't know the first thing about me. Ethan considered the question longer than the words deserved because the true answer sat somewhere he hadn't gone digging in a long time. I had a wife once, he said finally. Sarah, and a boy. Winter took them both 9 years back, sickness that came through faster than I could get help up the mountain in time. He looked at the fire, instead of at Clara, while he said it the way a man looks anywhere but at the thing that still hurts. I told myself after that I was done. Done with people, done with caring what happened to anybody outside these four walls, on account of caring is what breaks you when the world decides to take something from you. And I held to that. 2 decades of it. Until tonight, when I watched a room full of men decide a woman's worth by auction, and something in me that I thought I'd buried with my son stood back up whether I gave it permission to or not. The fire popped. Outside, the wind had begun to die down, the worst of the storm passing over the ridge. "I'm sorry," Clara said quietly. "About your wife. Your boy." "Wasn't asking for sympathy," Ethan said, though not unkindly. "Just answering your question honest, since you asked it honest." They sat with that for a while, the particular quiet of two people who had each just handed the other something fragile and were waiting to see if it would be dropped. "There's something you should know," Clara said finally, and her voice had changed, steadier now, purposeful, like a woman gathering the last of her strength for something that mattered more than her own pride. She reached into the small pocket sewn into the lining of her dress, one Caleb apparently hadn't thought to search, and drew out a small carved wooden bird, rough-hewn, clearly whittled by a child's unpracticed hand, its wings slightly lopsided. "My daughter made this," she said, turning it over in her fingers like it was the only solid thing left in her world, which Ethan understood watching her. It probably was. "Her name is Lily. She's 6 years old. Her father died of the same fever that near killed me, and while I was still too sick to stand, my husband's cousin took her from the house and sold her labor contract to a mining operation 2 valleys south to cover what he claimed was owed on my husband's debts." Her jaw tightened, and for the first time since Ethan had pulled her out of that saloon, he saw something in her that wasn't survival. It was fury, cold and precise and entirely intact beneath all that weariness. "I have spent the better part of a year trying to find a way south to her. I have no money, no family left who'll claim me, and no man willing to escort a woman with nothing to offer him in return. Tonight in that saloon, I wasn't afraid for myself anymore. I gave up being afraid for myself a long time ago. I was afraid because if Caleb sold me to some man who dragged me off to a different territory, I would never find her. That's the only reason I didn't fight harder in that room. I was calculating the whole time which outcome kept me closest to the road south." Ethan sat very still. "I don't need saving, Mr. Calloway," Clara said, meeting his eyes directly now without flinching, without the careful blankness from before. "I've been saving myself for 2 years, one impossible day at a time. What I need is someone willing to ride with me into a mining camp full of armed men and demand back what belongs to me. I know that's a great deal to ask of a stranger who's already given me more than I had any right to expect tonight. But I'm asking it anyway, because I have nothing left to lose by asking, and everything left to lose by staying silent." Ethan looked at the small wooden bird, still turning in her fingers, at the fierce, exhausted light in her eyes, at a woman who had just been dragged across a saloon floor and sold for $20, and was within hours of that humiliation, sitting in a stranger's cabin, negotiating not for her own comfort, but for her daughter's freedom. He thought about Sarah. He thought about the boy buried in ground so frozen it had taken 3 days of fire to soften. He thought about 20 years on this mountain, telling himself that wanting nothing meant losing nothing, and how that had never once, in all that time, actually stopped. The losing? It had only stopped the living that was supposed to happen in between. "Where's this mining camp?" he said. Not a question. Already somewhere underneath the words, a decision. "Silver Creek," Clara said. 2 days' ride, maybe 3 in this weather. A man named Victor Hale runs it. He buys labor contracts cheap and works children in the tunnel shafts because their hands fit where a grown man's can't. I've heard men in Black Hollow talk about it like it's just business, like it's ordinary. Ethan's jaw set hard. "It ain't ordinary," he said. "It's just been allowed to go on so long folks stopped calling it what it is." "You don't owe me this," Clara said. You already bought me out of that room. You already gave me more than any man's given me in 2 years. I won't think less of you if you say no and put me on a stagecoach south come spring and call your debt paid in full." Ethan stood, walked to the window, looked out at the snow settling soft and silent over the ridge where hours ago he'd have said nothing. In this world could pull him off this mountain again. "I spent 20 years telling myself the world wasn't worth stepping back into," he said without turning around. "Tonight I stepped into a saloon full of men treating a woman like cattle at auction, and I didn't think twice before I did it. Reckon that tells me something about myself. I've been too stubborn to admit for a long while." He turned back to face her. "I'll take you to Silver Creek, Clara, and I'll stand beside you when you walk in there and take your daughter back, whatever standing beside you costs me. That's not charity. That's not a debt owed. That's just what a decent man does when he's finally stopped pretending decency is optional." Clara's hand tightened around the small wooden bird until her knuckles went pale. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Ethan said grimly, already turning toward the rifle rack, already calculating powder and provisions and the fastest safe road south through territory he hadn't ridden in years. "Thank me after we've gotten your girl out of that man's hands. Victor Hale's not gonna hand a child back over just because we ask him nicely, and I aim to be ready for whatever kind of man he turns out to be." Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the mountain wrapped in a silence so complete it felt like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what a mountain man and a woman who refused to be broken were about to do to a place that had built its fortune on the suffering of people too small and too powerless to fight back. Clara sat by the fire, turning the little wooden bird over and over in her hands, and for the first time in 2 years allowed herself to believe carefully guardedly, the way a person allows themselves anything after enough disappointment, that her daughter might actually come home. Morning came gray and hard, the kind of cold that settled into a man's teeth before he even stepped outside. Ethan was already at the fire when Clara woke. Coffee-boiling saddlebags packed his rifle laid across the table, getting a last oiling before the ride. "You didn't sleep," Clara said, sitting up on the bed, the blanket pulled around her shoulders. "Slept enough." He didn't look up from the rifle. "Man doesn't need much sleep when there's a job in front of him worth doing. You could have woken me. I'd have helped. You needed the rest more than I needed the company." He set the rifle down, finally looked at her. "You're still healing, Clara. That bruise on your face hasn't even gone yellow yet. I'm not dragging you 2 days south on a horse without you having one full night's sleep first." She didn't argue that, though he could see in her face she wanted to. Instead, she stood, wrapped the blanket tighter, and crossed to the fire to pour herself coffee, like she'd done it in this cabin 100 mornings before, instead of one. "I want to say something," she said, "and I want you to hear the whole of it before you answer." Ethan set down the oil rag. "All right. I know what I'm asking you to do. I know Silver Creek isn't some town social where we knock politely and Victor Hale hands my daughter back because we asked nice. I've heard what kind of men work for him. I've heard about the sheriff 2 counties over who takes his money to look the other way." She wrapped both hands around the tin cup like it was the only warm thing left in the world. "If you want to back out now this morning before we ride, I won't think less of you. I'll walk to Silver Creek myself if I have to. You wouldn't make it a day, maybe not, but I'd try." Her chin lifted, and there was iron in it, the same iron he'd seen the night before when she'd pulled that little wooden bird out of her pocket like it was the last coin in the world. "I need you to understand that about me before we ride together, Mr. Calloway. I am not a woman who waits nicely for things to be done on her behalf. I have buried a husband, lost a home, and spent 2 years clawing toward my daughter with nothing but my own 2 hands. If you're riding with me, you're riding with someone who's going to walk into that camp whether you're beside me or not." Ethan studied her for a long moment, the firelight catching the fierce, exhausted determination in her face, and something in his chest, that same crack from the saloon the night before, widened another inch. "I already told you I'm coming," he said. Don't reckon I need convincing twice, but I'll tell you something in return since we're laying things out plain this morning." He stood shrugging into his coat. "You go running into that camp on your own without a plan, you'll get yourself killed. And then who finds Lily? You want to save your daughter. You're going to have to trust somebody enough to let them help you do it smart instead of just fast. That's not me telling you to sit quiet and let a man handle things. That's me telling you two people thinking clear beats one person running blind every time." Clara's jaw worked. For a moment he thought she'd argue it. Instead, slowly she nodded. "Fair," she said. "Fair," he agreed, and something passed between them that wasn't quite friendship yet, but was no longer strangers either. They rode out within the hour, Samson's breath clouding in the cold. Clara wrapped in one of Ethan's old coats that swallowed her twice over, the sleeves rolled to free her hands. The mountain trail dropped steadily south, switchbacking down through stands of pine gone white with frost. And for the first mile, neither of them spoke the silence comfortable in a way silence rarely was between people who'd known each other less than a full day. It didn't stay comfortable long. Halfway down the second ridge, Samson's ears went flat, and his stride broke, and Ethan felt the horse's whole body tense beneath him, a half second before he heard it himself. Hoofbeats fast coming up the trail from below. "Off the trail," Ethan said, already turning Samson toward the tree line. "Now!" They'd barely gotten into the cover of the pines when the rider came around the bend, and Clara's breath caught audibly. "Caleb," she whispered. It was. The gambler rode hunched in his saddle coat collar up against the cold, and he reined his horse hard when he spotted Samson's tracks cutting off the main trail, sitting there a moment, scanning the tree line with the particular paranoia of a man who owed money to people worse than himself. "Calloway," he called out, voice carrying thin in the cold air. "I know you're up in them trees somewhere. I ain't here for trouble." Ethan's hand rested easy on the stock of his rifle, not raising it, just resting there. "Stay behind me," he murmured to Clara, and nudged Samson back out onto the trail, positioning his own body between her and the gambler, without making it look deliberate. "What do you want, Caleb?" Ethan said flat. Caleb's eyes flicked past him to Clara, and something calculating moved behind them. "Word's already getting around Black Hollow about what you did last night," he said. "Buying her out like that. Some folks are saying it wasn't legal me selling off a debt like that in the first place. Sheriff Doss is asking questions." "Sheriff Doss can ask me his questions directly next time I'm in town," Ethan said. "Why are you really out here, Caleb? You don't ride 2 hours in this cold over gossip." Caleb's smile thinned. "Fine. Straight talk then. I hear you two are headed south. Silver Creek way." His eyes went to Clara again, sharper this time. "You go stirring up trouble with Victor Hale over that girl's labor contract. You're gonna find out real quick that man's got friends in places that matter more than some mountain hermit's rifle. I'm telling you this as a—" He seemed to search for the word, "a courtesy," on account of the $20. "Some courtesy," Ethan said, "warning a man off doing right by a child." "I ain't warning you off nothing. I'm telling you what's true. Hale's got the marshal in his pocket 2 counties over, and half the mining claims between here and the Colorado line run through paper his lawyers drew up. Man like that don't lose to a woman and a trapper with a rifle." Caleb's horse shifted under him, impatient with the cold. "I'm just saying. Whatever you find down there, it ain't gonna be simple." "Nothing worth doing ever is," Ethan said. Caleb held his gaze a moment longer, then shook his head, muttering something under his breath that might have been fool, or might have been something worse, and wheeled his horse back the way he'd come, spurring it hard enough that it half slipped on the icy trail before catching its stride and disappearing around the bend. Clara let out a breath she'd clearly been holding the entire exchange. "He's right, you know," she said quietly. "About Hale having friends. I've heard the same from women in Black Hollow who used to work his camp kitchens before they couldn't stomach it anymore. Then we go in smart instead of straight through the front gate hollering her name," Ethan said, turning Samson back onto the main trail. "Man like that relies on people being too scared or too proud to plan careful. We're not going to give him that advantage." They rode on the mountain, giving way slowly to rougher, scrubbier country, as the trail dropped in elevation, pine thinning into juniper and rock. By midday, the sun had burned off the worst of the frost, though the wind stayed sharp enough to cut through even Ethan's heavy coat, and they stopped at a shallow creek to water Samson and eat a cold meal of jerky and hardtack standing up, neither of them willing to lose the daylight sitting still too long. "Tell me about her," Ethan said, chewing. "Lily, what's she like?" Clara's whole face changed at the question, softened in a way it hadn't once since Ethan had pulled her out of that saloon. "Stubborn," she said, and there was a laugh underneath the word, small and worn but real. "Stubborn as a mule, and twice as loud about it when she doesn't get her way. She used to follow her father around the ranch from the time she could walk, insisting she could do whatever the hired men were doing, no matter how many times we told her she was too small." Her fingers found the little wooden bird in her pocket, without her seeming to notice she was reaching for it. "She whittled me this the winter before her father died. Terrible at it. Cut her thumb twice, getting the wings even close to matching." Her voice thickened. "She's 6 years old, Mr. Calloway. Whatever they've got her doing in that mine, she's 6 years old." Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked south toward country. He couldn't see yet, but could already feel the shape of the way a man feels, weather coming before the sky shows it. "We'll get her out," he said finally. "You don't know that." "No," he admitted. "I don't. But I know what kind of man walks away from a job like this half-committed, and I know I'm not him, so we'll get her out, or we won't stop trying till we do. That's the only promise I've got worth making." Clara looked at him for a long moment, something working behind her eyes that he couldn't fully read, and then she nodded once sharp and swung back up onto Samson without another word, because some things didn't need more words put on them. They made camp that night in a shallow rock overhang that broke the wind, a small fire built low and careful against the stone, so the light wouldn't carry far. Clara sat close to the flame, her knees drawn up, watching Ethan work at repacking the saddlebags, with the particular efficiency of a man who'd spent decades doing everything alone and had never had to explain his own methods to anybody. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Reckon you're gonna whether I say yes or not." A ghost of a smile. "Fair point." She wrapped her arms around her knees. "Your wife, Sarah, what was she like?" Ethan's hand stilled on the saddlebag buckle for just a moment before continuing. "Gentle," he said. "Gentler than me by a wide stretch. She used to say I had enough hardness in me for the both of us, so she didn't need to carry any." He set the bag aside, sat back against the rock. "We came out west together before the war, even trying to build something out of nothing the way everybody was back then. Had 4 good years. Our boy Daniel was 3 when the fever came through." He stared into the fire. "I was 2 days ride out trapping when it started. By the time I got back, Sarah was already too far gone to recognize me, and Daniel went 2 days after her. I buried them both in ground so hard I had to burn fires on it 3 days running just to soften it enough for a shovel." Clara didn't say anything for a moment, then quietly, "I'm sorry, truly." "Wasn't looking for sorry," Ethan said, though there was no edge to it, just old worn honesty. "Just answering what you asked." He looked over at her. "That's why I went up the mountain and stopped coming down. Told myself if I never let anybody else matter that much again, I'd never have to bury anybody else. 20 years of telling myself that." A short, humorless breath. "Then last night I bought a stranger out of a saloon without thinking twice. And today, I'm riding toward a mining camp full of armed men to steal back a 6-year-old girl I've never even met. Reckon the mountain didn't take as well as I thought it did." "Maybe it's not that it didn't take," Clara said. "Maybe it's that some things are just worth breaking a promise to yourself over." Ethan looked at her across the low fire, and something passed between them. Again warmer this time, something neither of them named out loud. And for a while they just sat there in the quiet, the fire popping, the wind moving through the rocks above them. 2 people who'd been strangers a day before, now bound together by something neither of them had asked for, and neither of them, if either was honest, wanted to walk away from any more. They reached the river crossing the next morning, and it was worse than either of them had expected. The ford Ethan remembered from years back had shifted with spring runoff long past, leaving a narrower, faster channel cutting hard against a rock shelf, the water black and moving with a low, dangerous power. "We go slow," Ethan said, studying the current. "Samson's crossed worse, but I want you holding tight to me the second we're in past his knees. You feel him start to lose his footing. You do not try to swim clear on your own. You hear me? You hold on." "I hear you," Clara said. And there was no argument in it this time, just steady focus. The same focus he'd seen in her back on the mountain trail when Samson had slipped on the ice. They started across Samson, picking his way carefully over submerged rock, the water climbing past his knees, then his belly cold enough that Ethan felt it seep through his boots like a blade. Halfway across a submerged rock shifted under Samson's front hoof, and the horse lurched hard sideways, a scream tearing out of him as his back legs scrambled for purchase in the current. "Hold on!" Ethan shouted, and felt Clara's arms lock around his waist with a grip that would leave bruises, her whole body pressed flat against his back as Samson fought the water hooves, striking rock, the current dragging at all three of them with a strength that made Ethan's own heart hammer against his ribs. For 3 long seconds, it seemed certain the horse would go down, would roll, would take them both under the black freezing water with him, and then Samson's back hooves caught solid stone, and with one massive straining lunge, he heaved them up onto the shallower shelf on the far side chest, heaving steam rising off his wet flanks into the cold air. Ethan sat there a moment, breathing hard, Clara's arms still locked around him. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm all right," Clara said, though her voice shook. "Are you?" "Fine." He guided Samson the rest of the way up the bank onto dry ground, and only once they were solidly clear did Clara's arms finally loosen, and Ethan felt more than saw the way she pressed her forehead briefly against his back, just for a second, before straightening, composing herself the way he was already learning was her particular habit. Fear allowed exactly as much room as it took to pass, and not 1 second more. "Reckon that's the last river between here and Silver Creek," Ethan said once they'd dismounted to let Samson rest and dry. "Small mercies," Clara said, wringing water from the hem of her borrowed coat. They were still working the worst of the wet out of their gear when Ethan's head came up sharp, his hand going instinctively to his rifle. "Someone's coming," he said. Clara froze. "Hale's men." "Don't know yet." Ethan positioned himself between her and the sound, a lone set of hoofbeats moving fast and uneven like a rider pushing a tired horse past what it had left to give. A moment later, a man came around the bend in the trail, thin, ragged of beard, grown wild and untrimmed. His coat torn at one shoulder, riding a horse that looked half-starved and close to foundering. He saw them and nearly fell off his own horse in his hurry to stop. "Please," he said, voice cracked and desperate. "Please, I ain't looking for trouble. I just need, is there a town near here? Somewhere I can—" "Easy," Ethan said, hands visible, rifle still slung. "Nobody's looking to hurt you. What's your name?" "Amos," the man said, still breathing hard, eyes darting back the way he'd come, like he expected pursuit any second. "Amos Reeves. He seemed to notice for the first time the direction they were traveling, and something in his face went even paler. "You're headed south, toward Silver Creek." Clara stepped forward. "You know it." Amos let out a short, broken laugh that had no humor anywhere inside it. "Know it. Ma'am, I worked it. 2 years. Only reason I ain't there right now is I finally found the nerve to run, and I ain't stopping till I've put a whole territory between me and Victor Hale." Clara's hand found Ethan's arm, gripping tight. "There's a girl there," she said, fast, urgent. 6 years old, Lily Whitfield. Have you seen her?" "Do you know?" "Ma'am, there's near 30 children in that camp," Amos said, and something about the flat, exhausted way he said it made Clara's face go bloodless. "Hale keeps 'em in the low tunnels, the ones a grown man can't fit through proper. Says their small hands are worth more to him down there than a full-grown miner's wages. Works 'em 12 hours some days, feeds 'em just enough to keep 'em standing." His eyes flicked between them. I couldn't tell you one girl from another, ma'am. Wish I could. But if she's been there more than a week, she's in the tunnels, same as the rest. Clara made a sound Ethan hadn't heard from her yet. Small Wounded immediately swallowed back down, and he saw her hands curl into fists at her sides, saw the effort it took her not to break apart right there on the trail. Tell us everything you know, Ethan said to Amos low and steady, giving Clara the moment she needed to gather herself without drawing attention to it. The camp, the guards, Hale himself, anything that'll help us get in and get a child out alive. Amos hesitated, glancing again over his shoulder. You get me wrong, mister, I want to help. God knows somebody ought to burn that whole operation to the ground. But Hale's got 12 armed men on that camp at any given time, plus a foreman named Grissom, who's meaner than the lot of 'em combined, and the sheriff 2 counties over takes Hale's money regular enough he ain't gonna lift a finger to stop whatever's happening up there. He swallowed hard. There's talk, to talk. I only half believed till I saw the paperwork myself that Hale ain't just running a mine. He's got men forging land claims, buying up water rights cheap off families who don't know their deeds are being altered out from under 'em, selling the good parcels onto the railroad survey coming through next year at 10 times what he paid. The mine's just where he keeps the labor that does his dirty work, and can't talk back on account of being owned outright or close enough to it. Ethan's expression hardened. Land fraud. Bigger than that, mister. He's building himself an empire off broken people and forged paper, and anybody who gets too close to seeing the whole of it tends to have accidents. Amos's hand went unconsciously to the torn shoulder of his coat. That's how I got this. Foreman's boys caught me near the ledger room. I'm lucky I'm alive to be telling you any of it. When's the best time to move on the camp? Ethan said. Fewest guards, best chance of getting in quiet. Amos thought a moment, still visibly shaking, whether from cold or fear or both. Sundown to full dark, maybe. Guards change shift, then there's a window 10 minutes, maybe 15, where the count's thin while they're swapping out. His eyes went distant, remembering. But mister, I gotta warn you something else. I heard talk 'fore I ran. Hale's got buyers coming through in a few days. Railroad men and some other operation out east looking to buy up labor contracts wholesale. He's planning on selling off a batch of the children's contracts to move 'em out to a bigger operation, get 'em off his books before winter deepens, and feeding 'em gets more expensive than they're worth to him. He looked at Clara, something like genuine grief in his ragged face. If your girl's been marked for that sale, ma'am, you might not have but a handful of days before she's shipped clean out of this territory, and you'll never find her again. The color drained entirely from Clara's face. How many days? Don't know exact. Heard talk of it maybe a week back. Could be any day now. Ethan felt the ground shift under the whole plan in that moment, no longer a matter of careful patient reconnaissance stretched over days, but a race against a clock neither of them could see the face of. Thank you, Ethan said to Amos. For the warning. For all of it. You're a braver man than you probably feel right now telling strangers what could get you hunted. Amos gave a short, exhausted nod. Just get that little girl out if you can. Get all of 'em out if there's any way. I couldn't save nobody when I ran. Least this way maybe something good comes of me talking. He didn't wait for more conversation, spurring his tired horse north, with one last glance over his shoulder. Disappearing around the bend, the same way he'd appeared, leaving Ethan and Clara standing in the cold, with a timeline now hanging over everything like a blade. We have to move faster, Clara said, already turning toward Samson. If there's any chance she's on that list, we will, Ethan said, catching her arm gently, just enough to stop her to make her look at him. But Clara, listen to me. Moving faster does not mean moving reckless. If we ride into that camp half-cocked and get ourselves caught or killed, there's nobody left to get Lily out at all. We do this smart, same as we agreed, just faster smart. You understand the difference? Clara's breath came hard, her whole body vibrating with the need to run, to move, to close the distance between herself and her daughter by whatever means existed. But she made herself nod, made herself hold still under his hand a moment longer. "Smart," she said. "Fast and smart." "That's it," Ethan said. "That's exactly it." They rode hard the rest of that day, and into the next, stopping only as long as Samson needed to rest and drink, the country changing around them as they went. The mountains giving way to rougher foothill scrub smoke smudging the horizon, days before they ever saw the camp itself. A low, ugly haze hanging over a valley that no amount of clean mountain wind seemed able to clear. They came up on Silver Creek from a ridge to the north late on the second afternoon, and Ethan reined Samson to a stop well back from the crest, dismounting and gesturing for Clara to do the same. "We go the rest on foot," he said quietly. "Keep low. I want eyes on that camp before we make one single move toward it." They crawled the last stretch to the ridgeline on their bellies, and when Ethan finally raised his head enough to see over what spread out below him in the valley, made something cold and furious settle into his chest that had nothing to do with the wind. The camp was larger than he'd expected. A sprawl of rough buildings, mine entrances, cut black into the hillside guard towers at intervals along a crude perimeter fence. Even from this distance, even in the fading light, he could make out figures moving between the buildings. Small figures, too small, hunched under loads, too heavy for children their size, moving with the particular slow shuffle of people who had learned that moving too fast drew a guard's attention, and moving too slow drew worse. Beside him, Clara made a sound low in her throat, and he felt her whole body go rigid. "There," she breathed, pointing with a hand that shook. "By the water barrel. The blue, that's her dress. That's the dress she was wearing when—" Ethan followed her finger and saw a small figure hauling a bucket nearly as big as she was, stumbling under its weight. Dark hair escaping a rough braid. A dress that might once have been blue, faded now to something closer to gray with dirt and wear. "Lily," Clara whispered, and started to rise. Ethan's hand caught her shoulder, hard, pulling her back down flat against the ridge before she could expose them both to the guard towers below. "No," he said, low and urgent. "Clara, no. You go running down that hill right now, you get spotted before you're within 100 yards of her. And then what? They grab you. They grab her worse for the trouble. And I'm left trying to talk my way out of a standoff with 12 armed men with no plan at all. You want to save her. You do not move until we have a way to actually get her clear." "That's my daughter down there," Clara said, and her voice broke entirely for the first time since the saloon tears streaking silent down her face, even as she held herself still under his grip. "Right there, Ethan. I can see her. She's right there, and I can't—" "I know." His own voice had gone rough. "I know Clara. I see her too. And I am telling you, as someone who has already buried a child once in his life, and does not intend to watch anyone bury another one today, that the fastest way to lose her for good is to move before we're ready." Clara pressed her fist against her mouth, shoulders shaking with the effort of staying still, staying silent, watching her own daughter labor under a bucket too heavy for her from 100 yards away, and not being able to close that distance. They stayed on that ridge until full dark, watching the guard patterns, counting towers, marking the shift change Amos had told them about, and Ethan saw it happen almost exactly as described, a 10-minute window where the perimeter thinned guards, trading places at the gate with the bored, sloppy rhythm of men who'd done the same rotation 1,000 times without incident and had stopped expecting one. "There," Ethan murmured. "That's our window when we move. Not tonight, we don't know enough yet, and I want us in position before dark, not scrambling into it blind. Tomorrow. We use today and tomorrow to learn everything we can, and tomorrow night we move." "That's another whole day," Clara said. "Amos said we might not have days to spare. And if we go in tonight without a real plan, we might not have a chance at all," Ethan said. "I know how hard this is. I am telling you, plain, every part of me wants to walk down there right now with this rifle and start taking apart every man standing between your daughter and the gate. But that's not going to get her out alive, Clara. It's just going to get people killed, maybe her included. We do this careful. One more day." Clara closed her eyes, and for a long moment, Ethan thought she might refuse, might bolt down that hillside on nothing but grief and fury, and get them both killed for it. Instead, she took a long, shaking breath and nodded. "One more day," she said. But Ethan, if there's any sign at all that they're moving her before then we move faster, he said. I'm not asking you to sit on your hands while she's in danger. I'm asking you to trust that fast and reckless aren't the same thing, and only one of them actually gets her home. They pulled back from the ridge under cover of full dark, made a cold camp a half-mile off, where no firelight could carry toward the camp's guard towers, and ate in near silence, both of them still shaken by what they'd seen. I keep thinking, Clara said eventually, her voice small in the dark, that if I'd fought harder when Caleb dragged me toward that mine camp 2 years back, if I hadn't been so sick, if I'd found some way to stop him before he ever got Lily out the door. Don't, Ethan said, firm but not unkind. Don't do that to yourself. You didn't choose to get sick. You didn't choose to have a man like that in your family. None of what happened to her is a debt you owe for being human and getting overpowered by somebody worse than you. You hear me? It's hard not to. I know it is. Believe me, I know exactly how hard that particular kind of thinking is to put down once it's got hold of you. He was quiet a moment. After Sarah and Daniel died, I spent near 2 years convinced if I'd just been home instead of trappin', if I'd just gotten back one day sooner, I could have saved 'em both. Damn near drank myself into the ground over it before I finally understood some things ain't about what you could have done different. Some things are just the world being cruel, and blaming yourself for cruelty you didn't cause doesn't fix a single thing. It just adds a second wound on top of the first. Clara looked at him across the dark, something raw and grateful in her expression that she didn't try to put into words, and instead reached over, and for the first time since he'd pulled her out of that saloon, took his hand, not clinging, not desperate, just steady her fingers, lacing through his, in the cold dark, like an anchor, thrown between two people who'd each been drowning alone for longer than either wanted to admit. Ethan didn't pull away. They sat like that a long while. Hands joined the camp's distant lights. The only break in the darkness spread out below them, and something unspoken passed between them. In that silence, not a promise exactly, not yet, but the shape of one waiting to be given words, once there was room in either of their lives for anything besides the fight ahead of them. Get some sleep, Ethan said finally, gently pulling his hand back to bank what little fire they'd allowed themselves for warmth. Tomorrow's gonna ask everything we've got. Clara nodded, lay down on the thin bedroll, and though Ethan expected her to toss and turn with the same fury and fear that had gripped her on the ridge instead, she fell into an exhausted, grief-heavy sleep, within minutes worn past the point where even terror could keep her upright any longer. Ethan sat up a long while, after watching the distant camp, watching the small pinpricks of guard tower lanterns, thinking about a 6-year-old girl with a lopsided wooden bird, and a mother who'd been sold for $20, and had never once in 2 years of impossible odds stopped fighting to get her back. He thought about Sarah, about Daniel, about 20 years spent believing the safest life was the one lived furthest from other people's pain. He looked down at Clara, asleep beside the dying fire. Her face finally briefly unguarded in sleep, and understood with a certainty that settled into his bones like something permanent that whatever happened at Silver Creek tomorrow night, he was never going back to being a man who lived alone on a mountain, and called it peace. The next day passed in careful, exhausting reconnaissance, Ethan mapping guard rotations from the ridge with a patience that tested every nerve Clara had left, marking the foreman Grissom's movements. A broad, brutal-looking man who carried a horsewhip coiled at his belt and used it. They watched in sick silence on a boy no older than 10 who'd stumbled under a load near the mine entrance. Clara had to press both hands over her own mouth to keep from crying out. By late afternoon, they'd learned the shape of the camp well enough to risk it the tunnel, where the smallest children worked the barracks building where they were locked in at night, the thin stretch of fence along the camp's eastern edge, where the guard tower's angle left a blind spot for nearly 2 full minutes during the shift change. 2 minutes, Ethan said low as dusk began settling over the ridge. That's the window. We get through that fence gap across to the barracks, get her and however many others we can manage, and back out before that tower guard turns his lantern back this direction. 2 minutes, Clara. That's all we get. Then that's what we'll use, Clara said, and her voice had gone steady in a way that told him she'd made her peace somewhere in the long hours of that day, with whatever fear remained, and set it aside in favor of the only thing that mattered now. As full dark settled over Silver Creek, and the first guard tower lantern swung toward the far side of the perimeter for the evening shift change, Ethan Calloway checked his rifle one final time, looked over at the woman beside him, steady, now fierce, nothing left in her face but resolve, and gave a single nod. "Let's go get your daughter," he said. They moved down the ridge together, low and silent, toward a fence line, a 2-minute window, and a camp full of armed men who had no idea that the woman they'd once treated as property was about to walk back through their gates and take back everything they'd stolen from her. The fence line came up fast in the dark, and Ethan dropped flat against the cold ground 15 yards short of it, pulling Clara down beside him, with a hand flat against her shoulder. "Wait for it," he breathed. "Wait." The guard tower lantern swung its slow arc away from them, sweeping toward the western perimeter, and for a count of maybe 90 seconds, the eastern fence sat in near total darkness. "Now!" They moved low and fast, Ethan's knife already out, sawing through the bottom 2 strands of wire, where the fence sagged nearest the ground. Clara held the gap wide while he cut her hand steady, despite the tremor Ethan could feel running through the whole of her. They were through in under a minute. Ethan pulled the wire back into rough position behind them, enough that a passing glance wouldn't catch it, and together they pressed flat against the shadow of a supply shed. Hearts hammering, listening. Nothing. No shout. No dog. No footsteps changing rhythm. "So far, so good," Ethan whispered. Clara didn't answer. Her eyes were already fixed on the low, windowless building 40 yards off the barracks they'd marked it that afternoon, a long structure with a single door and a padlock the size of a man's fist. They crossed the open ground in a crouching run, and Ethan had the lockpick from his saddlebag out and working before they'd even fully caught their breath, his big hands surprisingly delicate against the mechanism years of trapping, having taught him more about small, stubborn metal things than most men ever needed to know. The lock gave with a soft click that felt in that silence loud as a gunshot. Inside, the smell hit first sweat and sickness and cold earth. 30 small bodies packed into a space meant for half that many children curled together for warmth on thin pallets, none of them stirring at first in the dark. Then one did. A boy, maybe 8, sat bolt upright, eyes wide with the particular terror of a child who has learned that any sound in the night means something bad is coming. "It's all right," Clara whispered, dropping to her knees beside him before Ethan could stop her, her voice pitched low and impossibly gentle. "We're not here to hurt anybody. We're looking for a little girl, Lily Whitfield. Do you know her?" The boy's eyes darted past her, scanning the room, then pointed with a trembling finger toward the far corner. Clara was moving before Ethan could catch her arm, weaving between sleeping children with a mother's instinct for exactly where her feet needed to land, and then she was on her knees again. And this time the sound that came out of her wasn't a whisper at all. It was a sob, choked down hard. At the last second, both hands reaching for a small shape curled beneath a thin, filthy blanket. "Lily." Barely audible. "Lily, baby, it's me." The girl stirred, confused, blinking up into a darkness that slowly resolved into a face she hadn't seen in what must have felt to her like forever. "Mama, I'm here," Clara breathed, gathering her up so fast and so tight that Lily made a small, startled sound. I'm here, I've got you." Ethan stood watch at the door, throat tight in a way he hadn't expected, and around the room other children were waking now, sitting up watching the reunion with the particular hollow-eyed hunger of kids who hadn't seen anybody come to claim them in longer than they could count. "We can't just take her," Ethan said quietly, and hated himself even as the words left his mouth, watching Clara's whole body flinch at the sound of them. "Clara, look around you. There's 30 children in this room. I know that," Clara said, not letting go of Lily for 1 second. "I know Ethan, but I only planned for one." "Then we adjust the plan." He was already moving, crouching beside the nearest pallets, keeping his voice at that same careful whisper. "Anybody here strong enough to walk fast and stay quiet, you're coming with us tonight. Anybody too small or too sick, we get you help another way, I swear it. But tonight we take who we can." A ripple went through the room. Children looking at each other, at the two strangers at the door, standing open onto a darkness that might mean freedom or might mean worse trouble than the one they already knew. "Please," a girl near the back whispered. "Please don't leave without my brother. He's in the other building, the sick ones." "We'll find him," Ethan said, though he had no idea yet how that promise would hold, and pushed the thought aside because there wasn't time to weigh it properly. "Everybody up, quiet as you can manage. Follow Clara." It took 90 seconds to get a dozen of the strongest children on their feet, and every one of those 90 seconds felt to Ethan like standing on a blade's edge, waiting for it to tip. It tipped. A dog started barking somewhere near the mine entrance, not at them, not yet. Just the reflexive bark of an animal disturbed by something, and a heartbeat later, a man's voice called out sharp and alert from the direction of the guard tower. "Somebody's moving by the barracks. Go!" Ethan said, no more whispering now. Urgency overriding caution. Go straight for the fence gap. Don't stop for anything." They spilled out of the barracks into the open ground, a dozen children running low and fast behind Clara. Ethan bringing up the rear with his rifle ready, and the guard tower lantern swung hard in their direction, throwing harsh yellow light across the whole scrambling group. "Hail, hail! They're running the children!" A gunshot cracked into the night air, a warning shot high and wild, but it sent every child in the group flinching and stumbling, and Ethan felt his whole chest go cold with a fear sharper than anything the river crossing had given him. "Keep moving," he roared. "Don't stop, don't look back. Get to that fence." They were 40 yards from the gap when the first real obstacle stepped into their path. A broad, heavy-shouldered man with a coiled horsewhip at his belt, and a face carved from pure meanness, flanked by 2 armed guards, all 3 of them cutting off the straight line to the fence. "Well now," the man said, and his voice carried the particular satisfaction of someone who enjoyed exactly this kind of moment. "Foreman Grissom at your service. And who might you be, mister, thinking you can just walk in here and steal Mr. Hale's property?" "Children ain't property," Ethan said, stepping forward, putting himself between Grissom's men and the huddled group of kids at his back, Clara gathering them protectively behind her own body as well. "Not his, not yours, not anybody's." Grissom's hand went to his belt, not for the whip this time, but for the pistol holstered beside it. "That's a mighty philosophical position for a man about to get shot for trespassing. Try it," Ethan said, rifle already leveled steady as stone, despite the chaos breaking loose around them. More shouts coming now from deeper in the camp, more lanterns swinging awake. "See how philosophical I get about putting a bullet through a man who whips children for stumbling under a load too heavy for 'em." Something flickered across Grissom's face. Not fear exactly, but a recalculation. A man used to holding all the power in any given room, suddenly uncertain whether that held true tonight. It was in that half-second of hesitation that a new voice cut across the yard, calm-cultured, chilling in its complete lack of urgency against all the noise around it. "Stand down, Grissom. Let's not waste bullets on something we can settle with conversation." The crowd parted guards, stepping back, and a man walked into the lantern light with the unhurried gait of someone who had never once in his life felt genuinely threatened. Victor Hale was younger than Ethan had pictured, maybe 45. Dressed better than anyone had any right to be dressed in a mining camp. His coat cut fine, his boots polished despite the dust everywhere else, his face pleasant in the particular way of men who had learned that charm was a far more efficient weapon than force most of the time. "Well," Hale said, looking over the scene. The huddled children Clara gathered around them protectively, Ethan's rifle steady between himself and Grissom's men. "This is a genuinely impressive amount of trouble for one little girl, Mr. Calloway," Ethan said. "And it ain't for one little girl anymore, Hale. It's for every child you've got locked in that barracks working tunnels too small for grown men on account of you decided their small hands were worth more to you than their whole future." Hale's smile didn't waver. "Business is business, Mr. Calloway. Somebody's got to work those veins. I'm simply efficient about who." "You call slavery efficiency," Clara said, and her voice when it came carried none of the fear Ethan half expected. It came out hard, precise, cutting through the yard like a blade. "I know exactly what you call it in your ledgers, Mr. Hale. I kept books for my husband's ranch for 6 years before you had a man forge my brother-in-law's signature on a debt claim that didn't exist." Something shifted in Hale's face, the first genuine crack in that pleasant, unbothered mask. "I don't know what you're talking about, ma'am." "I think you do," Clara said, stepping forward slightly, chin high, and Ethan felt something in his chest swell with a pride he had no name for yet. "My husband's ranch sat on the survey line for the railroad spur coming through next spring. I've heard the talk in Black Hollow same as anybody about parcels along that line changing hands for a fraction of their worth, right before the railroad company's buyers came through, offering 10 times the price. My husband died of fever. 2 months later, my brother-in-law suddenly discovered a debt against the estate he'd never once mentioned while my husband was alive, sold off everything we owned to settle it, and sold my daughter's labor contract south to cover the rest." Her voice shook now, but not with fear, with fury controlled and precise. "That's not coincidence, Mr. Hale. That's a pattern. And I'd wager it's a pattern that runs through half the fresh widows and dead men's estates for 50 miles around this camp." For a long moment, Victor Hale said nothing at all, and the silence stretched taut enough that Ethan could hear his own pulse in his ears. Then Hale laughed, short, genuinely delighted, the laugh of a man impressed despite himself. "You're sharper than most of the ranch wives who wander into my business unasked," he said. "I'll give you that." He tilted his head, studying her with new interest, the way a man studies an opponent who has surprised him. "You're not entirely wrong, Mrs. Whitfield. Land along that survey line is valuable. Widows and fools who don't understand what they're sitting on are considerably easier to negotiate with than men who do. Your brother-in-law owed me considerably more than he could pay from an entirely unrelated matter, and I offered him a way to settle it that cost him nothing but a signature on a piece of paper he barely bothered to read. Everyone came out ahead. Except, I suppose, you." "And my daughter," Clara said. "Don't forget her." "Your daughter is a highly efficient laborer for her size," Hale said, and there was no cruelty in his voice, which somehow made it worse, just flat, business-like calculation. "I'm not a monster, Mrs. Whitfield. I'm a man who understands that this territory rewards efficiency, and sentiment has never once turned a profit." "Funny," Ethan said, rifle still level. "I've found the opposite to be true my whole life. Every man I've ever known who called sentiment worthless ended up alone and hated by everybody who ever had reason to know him. Reckon you're headed the same direction, Hale, whether tonight ends your way or mine." Hale's eyes moved to Ethan, assessing, and something colder settled behind that pleasant mask. "You're the mountain man, aren't you? The one who bought her out of Black Hollow for $20. A small, genuine laugh. "I heard about that. Sentimental gesture. Cost you $20 to feel like a hero for one night. I wonder what it's about to cost you now." "Whatever it costs," Ethan said. "I reckon it's cheaper than the price you're going to pay when word gets out what's really happening in this camp." "And who exactly is going to spread that word, Mr. Calloway?" Hale's voice had gone soft, almost gentle, the tone of a man laying out an obvious truth to someone slow to grasp it. "The sheriff 2 counties over takes a comfortable retainer from my operation, and has for 3 years. The territorial marshal has never once found reason to ride out this far. The railroad surveyors who'll be through in the spring don't ask uncomfortable questions about labor sourcing, so long as the land parcels are clear and the price is right. You think one mountain hermit and one grieving widow are going to unmake all of that with a rifle and a righteous speech? No," Ethan said. "I think people who've been silent too long finally have someone standing beside them." Hale's smile thinned. "Poetic. Grissom, disarm him." Grissom's men moved, and for a terrible 3 seconds, the whole yard held its breath. Guns leveling, children screaming and scattering behind Clara, the entire fragile plan teetering on the edge of catastrophe. And then a new voice split the darkness from beyond the fence line, ragged and furious. "Nobody's disarming anybody, Grissom. Not tonight. Amos Reeves came through the fence gap at a dead run, and behind him, Ethan's breath caught. Behind him came 6 more men, ranchers by the look of them, weathered and grim-faced rifles already raised, and among them a face Ethan recognized with a jolt. Otis, the barkeep from Black Hollow. Reeves rode through half the territory tonight, rousing every man who's lost land along that survey line to this bastard's schemes. Otis called out, leveling his own shotgun at Grissom's men. Took some convincing, but turns out there's a fair number of us who've been wondering for a year why our neighbors kept selling good land dirt cheap right before the railroad came calling. Reckon we just got our answer. The guards' formation wavered, uncertainty rippling through them as they found themselves suddenly outnumbered, and more dangerously, for Hale watching men who looked exactly like the debt-ridden families whose signatures had been forged on his paperwork. "This doesn't change anything," Hale said, though for the first time his voice had lost its perfect composure. "I have papers, gentlemen. Legal papers. Every transaction in this camp is documented and signed." "Funny thing about documents," Clara said, and she was moving now fast toward the low building at the edge of the yard that Ethan recognized from their reconnaissance as an office shack, guards too distracted by the standoff to stop her. "I spent 6 years reading ledgers for a working ranch, Mr. Hale. I know exactly what an honest set of books looks like, and I know exactly what it looks like when somebody's cooked the numbers to hide where the money's really coming from." "Get her away from that office," Hale snapped, and 2 guards lunged toward the shack, but Amos and one of the ranchers cut them off, and in the chaos of shouting and scrambling, Clara reached the door, wrenched it open, and disappeared inside. Ethan's heart hammered, watching her go torn between covering the standoff in front of him and the terror of what might be happening in that dark little building. But he held his position, rifle steady, because he understood with a clarity that surprised him that this was Clara's fight to finish. Same as riding into the camp had been a fight he'd insisted on sharing rather than one he'd taken from her. She emerged less than 2 minutes later, a heavy ledger book clutched against her chest. Her face pale, but electric with something fierce and triumphant. "Here," she said, striding back into the lantern light, flipping the book open with hands that shook only slightly. "Here, look, this entry dated 8 months back. A land parcel sold for $40 an acre, signed off by a man named Harold Pruitt. I know Harold Pruitt, Mr. Hale. He died of a fever 4 months before that date. A dead man can't sign a deed." A murmur ran through the assembled ranchers, dark and dangerous. "And here," Clara continued, voice rising, "a labor contract for a girl named Lily Whitfield, signed by a guardian claiming legal authority, dated the same week my husband's cousin sold her south. Except the signature doesn't match his hand at all. I'd know his signature anywhere. I watched him forge documents for my husband's estate not 2 months before this one." She looked up, meeting Hale's eyes directly, and her voice cracked like a whip across the yard. "You didn't just buy labor cheap, Mr. Hale. You built this entire operation on forged signatures and dead men's names, and I am holding the proof of it in my own 2 hands." For the first time since he'd walked into that lantern light, Victor Hale looked unmistakably afraid. "Grissom," he said low and tight. "Take the ledger, now." Grissom lunged, but Ethan was already moving, stepping into the man's path with the full weight of his body, and the 2 men collided hard enough that Ethan felt the impact rattle up through his own shoulder. Grissom swung the horsewhip handle like a club, catching Ethan across the temple, and for 1 dizzy second, the whole yard tilted sideways. But Ethan had survived worse than a foreman's fists, and he came back up fast, driving his own blow into Grissom's jaw, with everything 20 years of mountain living had put into his arms. Grissom went down hard, and didn't immediately rise. "Anybody else?" Ethan said, breathing hard, rifle back up before the dust had even settled, sweeping across the remaining guards. Nobody moved. "Drop your weapons!" Otis called out his shotgun, steady the ranchers around him, closing ranks with grim, purposeful intent. "Every one of you. This camp's operation is done tonight one way or another, and I'd rather it end without more blood than's already owed." One by one, guards began lowering their rifles, glancing between each other, between Hale, between the sheer overwhelming reality that the men they'd been paid to intimidate had just become the men holding every advantage in the yard. Hale's composure finally fully shattered. "You have no authority here," he said, backing toward the office shack, eyes darting for any avenue of escape. "None of you. This is my land, my operation, my—" "Your operation built on stolen land and stolen children," Clara said, stepping forward. Ledger still clutched tight, and there was nothing left in her voice of the woman who'd trembled at a saloon bar 3 nights before. "I don't need a sheriff's authority to know what's right, Mr. Hale. And come morning, I intend to ride this ledger straight to the railroad company's regional office myself, because I'd wager men who care more about their reputation with investors than they do about you will be considerably more interested in these forged signatures than any local lawman you've got in your pocket." Hale's eyes went wild, calculating, and in the space of a single breath he made a decision that would prove to be his last mistake of the night. He lunged not for Clara, not for the ledger, but sideways toward the huddle of frightened children still gathered near the barracks, snatching at the nearest small arm, with the desperate calculation of a man reaching for the only leverage left to him. His hand closed on Lily's wrist. The whole yard went silent and still. In an instant, every rifle, every eye snapping toward the small girl suddenly yanked hard against Hale's side, his other hand producing a pistol from beneath his fine coat, and pressing it not quite touching against her temple. "Nobody move," Hale said, and his voice had gone thin and ragged, a man who had lost every advantage but one, and intended to spend it fully. "Nobody so much as breathes wrong, or I swear to you, let her go." Clara's voice came out low and deadly, the ledger falling forgotten from her hands, every ounce of triumph from a moment before, replaced by a mother's raw, absolute terror. "Victor, let her go right now." "Drop the rifle, Calloway," Hale said, ignoring her, his eyes fixed on Ethan. "Drop it or so help me." Ethan's hands went very still on the stock of his rifle, every instinct screaming at him to act and every ounce of sense telling him that one wrong move put a bullet through a 6-year-old girl's skull. Lily, to her credit, to a courage that made something in Ethan's chest ache fiercely, did not cry. She stood rigid in Hale's grip, small chin trembling, but held high, her eyes fixed not on the gun at her temple, but on her mother's face, searching it for the same certainty Clara had spent 2 years promising her existed somewhere in the world. "Mama," she said, small and steady. "Mama, don't be scared. I'm not scared." Something in that small, fierce declaration seemed to crack Clara open and steady her all at once. Grief and fury and love resolving into something razor-sharp. "Victor," she said, and her voice had gone strangely calm, now almost conversational, though Ethan could see the effort it cost her. "Think about what you're doing, right now. You've got maybe a dozen armed ranchers who've lost land to your schemes, standing not 30 feet away, a ledger full of forged signatures that'll see you hanged for fraud, even if the murder charge doesn't stick, and you're about to add the killing of a child to that list in front of 9 witnesses. There is no version of tonight where you walk away from this camp as anything but a ruined man. The only choice left to you is whether you walk away as a ruined man who's still breathing or one who isn't." "Shut up," Hale said, but his voice had lost its edge, something desperate and unraveling beneath it now. "Let her go." Clara continued, taking one slow, careful step forward, palms open, empty, non-threatening. "Let her go, and I give you my word in front of every man here that you walk out of this camp alive tonight. You run. You go as far as this territory lets you go before word of what's in that ledger catches up with you. That's more mercy than you've shown one single soul working in that tunnel behind you. But I'll give it to you anyway, because right now, in this exact moment, getting my daughter back alive matters more to me than watching you hang." The pistol at Lily's temple trembled, Hale's hand no longer entirely steady. "You're lying," he said. "You'll have every man here on me the second I let go." "I'm not lying," Clara said. Ethan's jaw worked every fiber of him, wanting nothing more than to put a bullet through Victor Hale for daring to put a weapon anywhere near that child. But he heard the plea underneath Clara's steady voice, understood exactly what she was asking of him, and forced his voice level. You have my word too, Ethan said. Let the girl go, and you ride out of here breathing. I can't speak for what happens once that ledger reaches the railroad company, or once a real marshal finally rides through asking questions. But nobody in this yard puts a bullet in your back tonight. That's my word, and I don't give it lightly. For 3 of the longest seconds of Ethan's life, Victor Hale stood frozen, calculating the whole weight of every choice he'd made, pressing down on a decision that had to be made in the space of a single breath. Then, slowly his hand loosened. Lily wrenched free the instant the grip slackened, sprinting the last 10 feet into her mother's arms with a speed that seemed to defy every hour of exhaustion in her small body. And Clara caught her, sank to her knees in the dirt, wrapped around her daughter with a sound tearing out of her that was half sob, half laughter, pure and raw and unguarded, in a way Ethan hadn't yet seen from her in the 3 days he'd known her. "I knew you would come," Lily whispered against her mother's shoulder. "I told the other kids. I told them my mama was gonna come, and you did, you came." Victor Hale didn't wait to hear the rest of it. He turned and ran for the horses tethered near the office shack, and nobody in that yard, true to 2 separate men's given word, raised a weapon to stop him. He was gone into the dark within a minute, hoofbeats fading fast toward the northern ridge, and something in Ethan settled grim and unsatisfied but steady, knowing that the fight wasn't fully finished. But the worst of tonight's danger had passed. Grissom, still dazed on the ground, made a weak attempt to rise, and one of the ranchers pinned him down with a boot to the chest before he'd gotten halfway up. "This one stays," Otis said. "Reckon a man who's whipped children for wages ought to answer for it proper, even if his boss got a head start running." Around the yard, the remaining guards' weapons already lowered seemed to understand with sudden complete clarity that whatever authority Hale's operation had held over them had evaporated the moment their employer fled into the night, and one by one they began backing away, hands raised, no fight left in men who'd only ever been loyal to a paycheck rather than a cause. Clara held Lily tight against her chest, rocking slightly, tears streaking freely down her face now that the danger had finally fully passed. And Ethan crossed the yard, slowly kneeling down beside them both, uncertain what his place was in a reunion this fierce and private, wanting to give them room, and unable to make himself step fully away. Lily lifted her head from her mother's shoulder and looked at him with eyes that were Clara's exact shade, red-rimmed and exhausted, and beneath all of it curious. "Are you the man who bought Mama?" she asked. "Lily!" Clara started half laughing, half mortified. "It's all right." Ethan said something warm, cracking through the grim tension still sitting in his chest. "Yes, ma'am, that's about the size of it. Bought her out of a bad situation anyway. Wasn't about to let her stay in it." Lily studied him a long moment with the frank, unfiltered assessment only a child could manage. "You're big," she said finally. "You look like you could carry a whole mountain." A short, surprised laugh broke out of Ethan before he could stop it. "Reckon I've carried a few things heavier than a mountain, little one. Nothing quite as important as getting you back to your mama, though." Around them, the yard was slowly transforming from battlefield to something else entirely. Otis and the ranchers moving through the barracks with lanterns gently rousing the remaining children, wrapping the youngest in coats and blankets, pulled from the guards who'd surrendered them without argument. Amos Reeves, still gaunt and ragged from his own escape, moving among the freed children with an expression Ethan recognized. The particular grief and relief of a man watching other people get the rescue he'd had to make alone. "We're not done tonight," Clara said quietly, standing with Lily's hand held tight in her own, looking around at the 24 other children still gathered frightened and uncertain in the lantern light. "There's still children in the sick building, still contracts to sort through families to find if any of them have families left to find." "No," Ethan agreed. "We're not done tonight, but we got the worst of it behind us." He looked down at the ledger still lying where Clara had dropped it in the dirt, and bent to retrieve it, brushing it off with careful hands. "This is gonna matter more than any of us standing here right now understands. Every family that lost land to forged paper, every child sold on a false contract. This book's the proof that sets it all right, or at least starts setting it right." Clara took the ledger from him, held it against her chest, alongside her daughter's small shoulders, and looked out over the camp. The freed children, the surrendered guards, Grissom pinned in the dirt. the office shack where Victor Hale's careful, cruel empire had just come apart at the seams. Because one woman refused to let herself be reduced to a line item in somebody else's ledger. "He's still out there," she said, "somewhere on that northern ridge riding for his life." "Let him run," Ethan said. "Man like that, guilty of what's written in that book, he'll be looking over his shoulder for the rest of whatever life he's got left. That's its own kind of justice, even if it ain't the kind that satisfies right away." He looked down at her, at Lily, leaning tired and safe against her mother's side, and felt something settle in his chest that hadn't been there in 9 long years. "Right now, I reckon the more important thing is getting every one of these children somewhere warm, somewhere fed, and letting the marshal, a real one, this time one Otis, and these ranchers'll see, is sent for proper sort, out the rest of what's owed." Clara looked up at him. Exhaustion and triumph. And something else entirely. Something neither of them had quite named yet, moving behind her tired eyes. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. For the $20 in that saloon, for riding 2 days through frozen rivers, for standing beside me in that yard, when I could have gotten us both killed, grabbing that ledger. Wasn't gonna let you walk into that office alone?" Ethan said simply. "Same as I wasn't gonna let you walk out of that saloon alone 3 nights back. Reckon that's just become a habit of mine where you're concerned." Something that might have been the beginning of a real smile, unguarded and warm, touched Clara's face for the first time since Ethan had met her, and beside her, still holding tight to her mother's hand, Lily looked between the two adults with the frank curiosity of a child noticing something grown-ups were trying very hard not to say out loud, and grinned. Behind them, the sky over Silver Creek had begun faintly to lighten toward dawn, the long night's danger finally loosening its grip on the valley. But the road home, Ethan understood, watching Clara gather her daughter close against the last of the cold, was only just beginning. Dawn came up gray and cold over Silver Creek. But for the first time in longer than Clara could remember, the cold didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like weather. Ordinary weather on an ordinary morning. The kind that happened whether or not the world was cruel that day. Otis had sent one of the younger ranchers riding hard for the territorial marshal's office the moment Hale fled north, and by mid-morning, the man had returned with news that curdled the relief in Clara's chest all over again. "Marshal Coyle's 3 days out," the young rancher said, breathless, his horse lathered white. "Says he'll come, but he ain't in a hurry about it neither. Word is, Hale's got money in that man's pocket too, same as everybody else out this way." "Then we don't wait on him," Ethan said, already moving toward where Grissom sat, bound and sullen against a fence post. "We document everything ourselves. Every child's name, where they came from, who signed what contract and when. We build a record so thick even a bought marshal can't wave it off without every rancher in 3 counties asking why." It took the better part of that day. Clara sat with the ledger open across her knees, Lily curled against her side, refusing to be more than an arm's length away, and one by one, the freed children came forward, some with names of families. They remembered some too young or too broken by the work to recall much of anything at all, and each of those blank, uncertain faces settled into Clara's chest like a stone she'd be carrying the rest of her life. "This one," she said quietly to Ethan, nodding toward a girl no older than 9, sitting alone near the barracks wall, arms wrapped tight around her own knees. "She won't say a name, won't say anything." Ethan crouched down slow, the way he might approach a spooked animal, not too close, not looking at her too directly. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to," he said. "Nobody's gonna make you, but there's food over by the fire if you're hungry, and nobody here's gonna raise a hand to you for taking it." The girl didn't answer, but an hour later, when Clara looked over, she'd moved 6 feet closer to the fire, and that Ethan told her quietly was its own kind of progress that couldn't be rushed. By evening, 3 families from neighboring valleys had ridden in, drawn by word spreading fast through the territory, the way word always did. Once enough men had seen something with their own eyes to stop being afraid of saying it out loud. Clara watched a mother fall to her knees in the dirt, sobbing, wrapping herself around a boy who hadn't said a word all day, and finally in his mother's arms began to cry too. And something in Clara broke open watching it. Grief and joy so tangled together she couldn't separate one from the other. Not everybody's getting that, Ethan said quietly, standing beside her. Some of these kids ain't nobody coming, not 'cause nobody loves 'em, 'cause there ain't nobody left. I know, Clara said. I keep thinking about it. What happens to the ones nobody comes for? Otis is talking to a family 2 valleys over, Ethan said. Good people lost their own boy to the same fever that took my Daniel. They got room and grief enough to want fillin'. Might be others like 'em once word travels far enough. He looked at her. It ain't a perfect ending, Clara. Ain't gonna be not for all of 'em. But it's a sight better ending than what they had yesterday. Grissom, still bound to the fence post, spent the day watching the reunions with a face gone increasingly gray, and by the time full dark fell, 3 of the angrier ranchers had gathered near him with a length of rope that had nothing to do with tying horses. String him up, one of them said, low and furious. Man's whipped children for 2 years. Marshall's 3 days out and Hale's already running free. Somebody in this camp ought to answer for it tonight. No? Ethan's voice cut across the yard flat and immovable, and he put himself bodily between the men and Grissom before the conversation could go any further. Not like this. Give me one good reason, Calloway. I'll give you 2. Ethan didn't raise his voice, but something in the stillness of him made every man there stop and actually listen. First, we hang this man ourselves tonight. We're no better than what he did to these children, deciding who lives and dies without a shred of law behind it. Second, and more important, a dead Grissom can't testify against Hale in front of a real court. A livin' one, scared enough of what's comin', might just tell every ugly detail of that operation to save his own neck. You want justice that actually sticks you, let the law have him. You want to feel better for one night and let Hale's real crimes maybe never see daylight proper, you go on and get your rope. The men wavered, anger still hot, but Ethan's logic settling cold water over it, and one by one they backed away muttering, leaving Grissom slumped against the post, shaking, staring at Ethan with something that might in a different man have resembled gratitude. Don't mistake that for kindness, Ethan told him low. I'd have let him if I thought it'd actually get these children justice. I just think you're more used to 'em breathin' and talkin' than swingin' from a rafter. They left 3 days later, once the marshal grim-tired, clearly displeased at having his hand forced by a valley full of ranchers who'd already done half his job for him, had taken formal custody of Grissom the ledger, and sworn statements from every adult present. He made no promises about catching Hale himself, and Ethan didn't expect any. But the marshal did take the ledger seriously enough to say the word fraud out loud in front of witnesses, and Clara understood that was as much a victory as this particular morning was likely to offer. The ride home took 2 full days, slower than the ride down had been. Lily perched in front of Ethan on Samson for the first stretch until her legs cramped, then switching to ride behind her mother, then by the second day, insisting stubbornly that she could walk alongside for a while, which lasted almost a full mile, before her legs gave out, and Ethan swung down without a word and lifted her onto his own shoulders instead. You're squishin' my hat, he told her deadpan, as she grabbed 2 fistfuls of his hair for balance. You don't got a hat on, Lily pointed out. Well, I would if you weren't sittin' on where it'd go. Lily laughed a real laugh, bright and unguarded, the first one Ethan had heard out of her, and Clara, riding alongside, watched the 2 of them with an expression that had softened entirely from the fierce, exhausted resolve she'd carried since the saloon. That night, camped in a shallow hollow that broke the wind, Lily woke screaming. Clara had her in her arms in an instant, rocking, murmuring, but the girl thrashed against the grip, still half-trapped in whatever nightmare had chased her out of sleep. And it took long minutes. Clara's voice low and steady, Ethan sitting close but not crowding, feeding the fire a little higher so the light would push back further against the dark before Lily's breathing finally slowed and her small body went slack with exhaustion rather than terror. The tunnels, she whispered finally into her mother's shoulder. I dream I'm still in the tunnels and nobody's comin'. I'm here, Clara said. I'm here, baby. We're not going back there, not ever. Sometimes the mountain gets loud with old dreams too, Ethan said quietly from across the fire, and Lily's eyes found him in the dark. Took me near a year after I lost my family before I could sleep a full night without waking up certain the fever had come back for me too. Dreams like that don't leave all at once. But they do leave little by little if you got people around you willing to sit up with you through the bad nights. Will you sit up with me? Lily asked, small and uncertain. Every single time you need it, Ethan said. That's a promise and I don't make those light. Lily studied him a moment. Then, to Clara's visible surprise, extracted herself from her mother's arms and crossed the small distance to settle instead against Ethan's side, tucking herself against his ribs with the uncomplicated trust of a child who had decided somewhere in the last 3 days that this particular large, gruff stranger belonged on her very short list of people who kept their promises. Ethan went very still for a moment, arm hovering uncertain in the air above her, before settling it carefully around her small shoulders. Over Lily's head, his eyes met Clara's, and something passed between them that neither one tried yet to put a name to. They reached the cabin on the third evening, and Lily stood in the doorway a long moment, taking in the single room, the fire already catching under Ethan's practiced hands, the rifle rack, the 2 chairs at the table, with the same careful assessing look her mother had given it 3 nights before. "This is where you live," she said. Not quite a question. "This is where we're gonna stay a while," Clara said, carefully glancing at Ethan. "If that's all right with you. It's got a real bed," Lily said, wonder creeping into her voice as she spotted it. "And a real fire that ain't outside." "Best I could offer," Ethan said a little roughly. "Ain't fancy, but it's warm and it's safe, and there ain't nobody gonna come through that door meanin' either of you harm while I'm standin' here to stop it." Lily crossed the room and without warning wrapped both arms around his leg in a fierce, sudden hug that nearly toppled him off balance. "Thank you for buying my mama," she said, muffled against his trousers, "and for coming to get me." Ethan crouched down slow, so he was closer to her height, and for a moment didn't seem to have any words at all, something working hard behind his weathered face. "Wasn't nothin' I wouldn't do again," he said, finally gruff. "Reckon I'd do it 100 times over if it came to that." The weeks that followed settled into something Ethan hadn't let himself imagine in 9 long years. A rhythm to the days that wasn't just survival anymore, but something closer to living. Clara took to the cabin's small routines with the same quiet competence she'd shown on the trail, mending what needed mending, stretching what little they had into meals that tasted to Ethan's surprise, like something a man might actually look forward to at the end of a long day. Lily trailed after him whenever he'd let her, peppering him with questions about tracking about the rifle, about why the pine trees stayed green when everything else went bare. "Because they're stubborn," Ethan told her once, hauling in firewood while she helped by carrying the smallest sticks 2 at a time. "Same as you." "Mama says I get that from her." "Reckon that's probably true too." It wasn't all easy. There were nights Clara sat up long after Lily had fallen asleep, staring into the fire, with an expression Ethan recognized from his own worst years, the particular hollow look of someone doing arithmetic on grief that never quite balanced. He didn't push those nights. He'd learned watching her that some wounds needed a witness more than they needed advice, and he made himself simply available, sitting near enough that she wouldn't feel alone in it, far enough that she never felt crowded. "I keep thinking about the others," she said one such night, weeks, in her voice low so as not to wake Lily. "The children who didn't have anybody come. The girl who wouldn't say her name." "I think about her too," Ethan admitted. "Wrote Otis last month asking after her. He says the Hendersons took her in finally, 2 valleys over. Says she started talking again little by little." Relief moved visibly through Clara's shoulders. "Thank you for finding that out, for caring enough to ask." "Wasn't hard to care," Ethan said. "Once you crack a man open, turns out there's more room in there for caring than he figured." It was nearly a month after they'd returned to the mountain that trouble came looking for them, and it came as trouble in Ethan's experience usually did, without any warning at all. He was out checking the trap lines when he heard Samson's warning whinny from near the cabin, sharp and urgent, and he was running before he'd even fully processed the sound rifle already in hand, boots skidding on frost-hardened ground. He came up over the last rise to find 2 riders he didn't recognize sitting their horses near the cabin, and Clara standing in the doorway, with Lily pulled close behind her skirts, her whole body a rigid line of protective fury. "Ethan Calloway!" the larger of the two men called out, not bothering to dismount. He had a hard, weathered face and a badge that Ethan didn't recognize pinned crooked to his coat. "Who's askin'?" "Deputy Marshal Cross, out of Fort Whitlow. This here's my associate." He nodded toward the second man, younger, with a coiled anger in his posture that made the hair on the back of Ethan's neck rise. "We're looking into the disturbance at the Silver Creek mining operation last month. Got word a mountain man matching your description led an armed assault on the property." "Armed assault," Ethan repeated flatly. "That what Hale's calling the rescue of 30 children he had working tunnels too small for grown men?" "Mr. Hale ain't been located to give his side," Cross said. "But he's got lawyers filed complaints in 3 counties calling it theft of property and assault with intent. Foreman's testimony backs the assault claim, and there's a ledger book gone missing from the property that his people say was stolen along with everything else." Clara stepped forward, still keeping Lily behind her, but her chin lifted with the same fierce precision she'd shown Hale himself. "That ledger is proof of forged deeds and fraudulent labor contracts, Deputy. I documented every page myself before it went to Marshal Coyle. If Mr. Hale wants to file complaints, he's welcome to explain to a judge why a dead man's signature appears on a land transfer 8 months after his burial." Cross's eyes moved to her, then back to Ethan, something calculating behind his flat expression. "That's a matter for the courts, ma'am, not for me to weigh out here on a mountainside. What I know is I got a warrant for questioning, and Mr. Calloway's coming with us to answer it." "He's not going anywhere," Clara said. "Ma'am, I'd advise you not to interfere with—" "Deputy," Ethan said, and something in his voice made even the younger, angrier rider go still. "I'll answer whatever questions the law's got for me. Always have my whole life. But I'll answer 'em in front of Marshal Coyle, the man who actually took that ledger into evidence and heard every witness statement from that camp firsthand. Not from 2 men I've never met riding up on my land with a badge I don't recognize, asking me to come along quiet, based on the complaint of a man who forged land deeds and enslaved children, and then ran like a coward the second he was caught doing it." The younger rider's hand twitched toward his holster, and Ethan's rifle came up a half-inch, not quite leveled, but close enough to make the intention plain. "Easy," Cross said to his own man, as much as to Ethan, clearly recalculating the situation. "Nobody's looking for a shootout on a mountainside, Calloway. But you understand my position. I got a job to do." "Then do it right," Ethan said. "Ride to Fort Whitlow, wire Marshal Coyle, confirm the ledger and the witness statements he's already got on file. You'll find I've got nothing to hide and considerably less to answer for than the man who filed the complaint against me. I'll be right here, same as always, whenever a real inquiry comes calling proper." Cross studied him a long moment, then looked past him to Clara, to Lily's small, frightened face, peering out from behind her mother's skirts, and something in his hard expression shifted some private calculation resolving itself. "That the girl from the mining contract?" he asked, quieter now. "That's my daughter," Clara said. "Free and staying free, and if you've got any decency at all under that badge, Deputy, you'll go find out the truth of what happened at that camp before you come back here threatening the man who saved her life." Cross held her gaze a moment longer, then gave a short, grudging nod, gathering his reins. "I'll wire the marshal," he said. "But I'll be back Calloway one way or the other. Man can't just shrug off a formal complaint, whatever the truth of it turns out to be." "I'll be here," Ethan said. "Ain't going anywhere." The 2 riders turned and left, and Ethan stood watching until they'd disappeared entirely down the mountain trail before he finally let the rifle drop from ready position, his whole body sagging slightly with the release of tension. Clara was at his side in an instant, her hand gripping his arm hard. "Do you think he'll come back with more men?" "Maybe." Ethan didn't lie to her, had learned already that she deserved better than comfortable lies. "Hale's got money enough to buy trouble in more than one county, same as Amos warned us. But we got truth on our side, Clara, and a marshal who already took that ledger serious enough to arrest Grissom. That counts for something even against a rich man's lawyers." It was 3 tense weeks before word came back, carried up the mountain by Otis himself, who arrived at the cabin looking older and more tired than Ethan remembered, but with news that loosened something tight in all their chests. "Coyle confirmed everything," Otis said, warming his hands at the fire, while Clara pressed hot coffee into his grip. "Ledgers authenticated. 3 separate handwriting experts down in the territorial capital matched the forged signatures back to a clerk Hale kept on retainer for exactly that purpose. Man's turned state's evidence now that he's looking at prison time himself, and he's naming names faster than anybody expected." "And Hale?" Clara asked, her voice tight. "Still running. Word is he made it clear to Nevada territory before anybody thought to wire ahead and stop him. But Coyle's filed federal fraud charges now on account of the railroad connections, which means it ain't just local law looking for him anymore. Man's got nowhere left in this country he can safely show his face, not with paper like that following him." Otis took a long pull of his coffee. "As for you, Callaway Coyle sent word himself that any complaint filed against you is dead in the water. Called what happened at that camp, and I'm quoting him here, the most justified use of force I've encountered in 11 years wearing this badge. Reckon that Deputy Cross fella won't be troubling you again." The relief that moved through the cabin was almost physical. Clara's shoulders dropping for what felt like the first time in weeks, Lily, who'd been listening from her spot by the fire with the solemn attention children give to conversations they only half understand but recognize as important, letting out a breath of her own. "So we're safe," she said. "For real this time." "For real this time," Ethan confirmed, and something in his own chest eased to hear himself say it and believe it. Otis stayed 2 days resting his horse and catching up on news of the freed children most placed with families. Now the girl who wouldn't speak, finally slowly learning to laugh again. In the Henderson household, Grissom's trial set for spring. Amos Reeves, having settled into steady work at a livery 2 towns over. Finally sleeping full nights without looking over his shoulder. "You did something good up at that camp," Otis told Ethan the morning he left. "Whole territory's talking about it. Might be the mountain man's reputation's about to get considerably more complicated than the fella who don't come down much." "Wouldn't mind that," Ethan said, surprising himself with how true it felt. Winter deepened around them after that, and with the immediate danger past, something in the cabin settled into a rhythm that felt more each day less like 3 people thrown together by circumstance, and more like something else entirely. Something Ethan didn't have a word for yet, but recognized in the particular warmth of it. He taught Lily to fish through a hole cut in the frozen creek, her small hands clumsy on the line, until with a shriek of pure delight, she hauled in a trout nearly as long as her forearm and refused to let anyone else touch it the rest of the walk home. "I caught it," she informed her mother solemnly over dinner that night. "All by myself. Ethan just held the hole open." "Cutting that hole took the better part of an hour with an axe," Ethan said deadpan. "But sure, I just held it open." Clara laughed, really laughed, bright and unguarded, and Ethan found himself watching her more than he watched his own plate struck again by how thoroughly the frightened, bruised woman from that saloon had transformed into someone who filled a room with her presence rather than trying to disappear from it. "You're staring," Clara said, not quite meeting his eyes, a faint color rising in her cheeks. "Am I?" "You are. Reckon I've got good reason to," Ethan said, and the words came out rougher and more honest than he'd intended. And for a moment, neither of them said anything else. The fire-crackling Lily oblivious over her fish. Something unspoken, settling more firmly into place between the 2 adults at that table. It was a hard thing, Ethan found, to watch a wound heal and not want to reach for what it revealed underneath. Clara's laugh came easier now, her hands steadier, the flinch that used to greet any sudden movement or raised voice fading week by week into something closer to trust. She'd started humming while she worked an old tune he didn't recognize, and one evening he found her teaching Lily the words to it, the 2 of them singing slightly off-key together, while Clara mended a torn shirt. And something in Ethan's chest ached so fiercely with the beauty of it, ordinary and unremarkable as it was, that he had to step outside a moment to collect himself. Spring announced itself slow, the way it always did on the mountain. Ice loosening its grip on the creek by degrees, the first green shoots pushing stubborn through half-frozen ground. And with spring came the promise Ethan had made, that very first night, one he'd been carrying quiet and heavy in his chest through the whole of the winter, dreading its arrival, even as he watched the snow begin to melt. He'd told her that first night she'd be free to go when the weather broke. He'd meant it as a kindness, then a way of telling a frightened souled woman that he wasn't another man laying claim to her. He hadn't understood, not fully, not until months of shared meals and shared silences, and the particular ache of watching Lily's laughter fill his cabin, just how much that promise was going to cost him to keep. But a promise was a promise, and Ethan Calloway had never in his life been a man who broke his word, even when keeping it felt like carving out a piece of his own chest. He spent 2 days preparing quietly without telling either of them what he was doing, saddling the mule he'd traded a winter's worth of pelts for, packing what supplies a woman and child would need for a journey south to wherever Clara chose to build a new life, counting out every dollar he had saved from years of trapping into a small leather pouch. He pressed into her hands one clear, cold morning, with hands that shook more than he wanted them to. "Storm season's past," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Roads'll be clear enough for travel now. I packed the mule with what supplies you'll need, and there's money enough here to get the two of you set up proper wherever you decide to go. Denver maybe, or further east if that's what you're wantin'. Someplace with more people, more opportunity for Lily than a mountain cabin's ever gonna offer her." Clara looked down at the leather pouch in her hands, then up at him, something unreadable moving behind her eyes. "You're sending us away," she said. "I'm keepin' my word," Ethan said, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to. "Told you that first night you'd be free to go come spring, owin' me nothin'. Meant it then. Mean it now, even though—" He stopped himself, jaw working, unable to finish the sentence. "Even though what?" Clara said quietly. Ethan looked away out toward the tree line, unable to hold her gaze while he said the truest thing he'd said in 9 years. "Even though the thought of this cabin being quiet again, of not hearin' Lily's laugh, or your voice hummin' while you work, feels like losing somebody all over again. And I told myself a long time ago I wasn't gonna let myself feel that particular kind of loss twice in one lifetime. But I gave you my word, Clara, and I mean to keep it, whatever it costs me." For a long moment, Clara said nothing at all, and Ethan braced himself, certain he'd just watched her make the calculation he'd spent all winter dreading: freedom, opportunity, a life for her daughter. Somewhere far from painful memories, weighed against a mountain man's cabin, and everything complicated, tangled up in staying. Then she set the leather pouch down on the table deliberately and crossed the small distance between them. "I've spent 2 years being told what I owed people," she said, her voice steady, fierce. The same voice that had stood down Victor Hale in a mining camp yard. "Owed my brother-in-law obedience for taking me in. Owed Caleb my silence for his so-called kindness. Owed every man in that saloon my body apparently for the crime of existing without a husband to protect me." She reached up, laid her palm flat against his chest, and Ethan felt his heart hammering hard enough he was certain she could feel it too. "I am done, Ethan Calloway, being told or telling myself what I owe. So hear me plain, because I'm only going to say this once, and I need you to actually listen instead of arguing me out of it on principle." Ethan went very still. "I am not staying because I owe you," Clara said. "Not for the $20, not for Silver Creek, not for a winter's worth of kindness. I never had any right to expect. I've paid whatever debt existed between us 10 times over, just by surviving what you helped me survive." Her hand pressed flatter against his chest, and her eyes, when they met his, held nothing guarded in them at all, nothing careful, nothing braced for disappointment. "I'm staying because somewhere in this past winter, watching you teach my daughter to fish and sit up with her through nightmares, and stand between me and every danger this territory's thrown at us, without once asking anything in return, this mountain stopped feeling like a place I was passing through. It started feeling like home. And you stopped feeling like the man who bought my freedom and started feeling like the reason I actually wanted to use it." Ethan's breath caught somewhere in his chest, and for a long moment he couldn't find a single word to answer, with 20 years of careful, deliberate solitude cracking open entirely under the weight of what she'd just said. Clara, he managed finally, rough and unsteady. I already lost a family once. I don't know if I've got the courage in me to risk that kind of loss again. I'm not asking you to risk losing me, Clara said gently. I'm asking you to risk loving me. There's a difference, same as there was a difference between panicking and letting a horse find its own footing back on that first ride down the mountain. You taught me that yourself, if you'll recall. Something broke open in Ethan's chest. Then 9 years of careful walls coming down all at once, and he reached up, cupped her face in both his hands, with a gentleness that belied every hard year etched into his own, and looked at her. Really looked at her. The woman who'd been sold for $20 in a saloon and had spent every day since refusing to let that be the whole of her story. I reckon, he said, voice thick. I've been in love with you since you told me you weren't performing, you were surviving. Didn't have a name for it then. Got one now. Say it, Clara whispered. I love you, Clara Whitfield, Ethan said, and the words came out steadier than he expected, like something that had been waiting a long time to finally be spoken aloud. I love you, and I love that girl of yours like she's my own, and I don't want either one of you riding south with a mule full of supplies I bought to say goodbye with. I want you to stay. Not because you owe me a single thing, because I'm asking you to plain and honest for the very first time in my life. Clara's eyes filled, and this time when she cried, it wasn't grief carried over from some old wound. It was something else entirely. Something that looked when Ethan brushed his thumb gently across her cheek to catch the tears remarkably like joy. Then I'm staying, she said. Both of us. For good if you'll have us. I'll have you, Ethan said, for as long as this mountain'll have me, and longer than that if there's any justice left in this world. From the cabin doorway, unnoticed until that exact moment, Lily's voice piped up with the particular satisfaction of a child who has just watched two very slow grown-ups finally arrive at a conclusion she'd reached herself months ago. Does this mean I get to call you Pa now? Ethan turned something raw and overwhelmed, moving across his weathered face and crossed the distance to kneel down in front of her, meeting her eyes at her own height the way he had that very first night in the cabin. Only if you want to, he said, voice unsteady. Ain't nobody gonna make you call me anything you don't feel in your own heart. Lily considered this with the same solemn gravity she brought to every important decision, then threw both arms around his neck with a fierce, sudden hug that nearly knocked him backward. I want to, she said. I've wanted to since you carried me on your shoulders and let me squish your invisible hat. Ethan laughed a real laugh, one that came all the way up from somewhere he'd thought had gone permanently quiet, 9 long years before, and wrapped his arms around the small girl, and over her shoulder found Clara watching them both with an expression of such complete, unguarded happiness that it settled finally and fully every last uncertain thing left in his chest. The leather pouch of money still sat on the table. The mule still stood saddled and packed out by the fence. Both of them monuments to a promise that had almost cost him everything he hadn't known he wanted until the moment it was nearly gone. Ethan Calloway looked around at the cabin that had held only silence and solitude for 9 long years now, filled instead with a woman who refused to be reduced to what other men decided she was worth, and a child who had claimed him as her own with nothing more than a single fierce hug, and understood, standing there with the last of winter melting away outside, and something entirely new. Beginning inside those 4 log walls that he had finally, after 2 decades of believing otherwise, found something on this mountain worth every risk of losing it. The days that followed the leather pouch and the mule packed for a goodbye that never happened settled into something Ethan hadn't dared imagine, even in his most hopeful private moments. Spring came on fast once it finally decided to arrive the way it always did on the mountain, and with it came a kind of busyness Ethan hadn't known in years. Not the busyness of solitary survival, but the busyness of a life built for more than one person to fit inside. We can't just keep calling it the cabin, Lily announced one morning sitting cross-legged on the floor while Clara braided her hair. Places got names. This one ought to have one too. That's so, Ethan said, working a splinter out of a fence post with more focus than the task strictly required, mostly to hide the smile pulling at his mouth. That's so. Lily considered the matter with her usual gravity. I'm thinking bird's rest, on account of Mama's bird. She meant the little wooden carving still kept careful on the mantel, where Clara had placed it the very first week, the one solid thing she'd carried with her, out of 2 years of losing everything else. Clara's hand stilled in her daughter's hair, something moving across her face too tender to name. Bird's rest. Ethan repeated slowly, testing the words. Reckon that's about the finest name I've heard for anything in my whole life. It became real that easily, not through any ceremony, just through the three of them saying it enough times that it stuck, the way most true things on the mountain seemed to take root, quiet and certain, without needing much fuss made over them. But not everything that spring arrived easy. Otis rode up again in the second week of thaw, and Ethan knew before the man had even swung down from his horse by the particular set of his shoulders that he wasn't carrying good news this time. Grissom's trial got moved up, Otis said, accepting the coffee Clara pressed into his hands, but not drinking it, just holding it like something to occupy his hands while he worked up to the rest. And there's something else, something you're going to want to sit down for, Calloway. Ethan didn't sit down. He stood very still instead, one hand finding its way to Clara's shoulder without quite deciding to put it there. Say it plain, Otis. Hale's lawyers filed a countersuit, Otis said. Down in the territorial capital, claiming the land your cabin sits on, this whole parcel near 200 acres, was never properly deeded to you at all. Saying it falls inside a survey boundary Hale purchased legal back before any of this trouble started, and that you've been squatting on land that's rightfully his the whole while. The coffee cup in Clara's hand went very still. That's a lie, Ethan said low and hard. I filed my claim on this land 11 years back proper through the land office in Denver. I've got the paper to prove it. I don't doubt you, Otis said. But Hale's a man running scared and looking for anything he can use to muddy the water, make you look less like the fella who exposed his crimes and more like a squatter with something to hide himself. Judge down south has agreed to hear it on account of the same railroad survey that's got half the territory's land claims in a tangle right now. Clara set the coffee cup down with a hand that trembled only slightly. He's trying to take the mountain, she said. The same way he tried to take everything else. Land children, whatever wasn't nailed down, and wasn't his to take in the first place. Won't work, Ethan said, though the muscle in his jaw had gone tight. I've got my deed, filed proper, witnessed proper. Ain't no judge in this territory gonna side with a fugitive facing federal fraud charges over an honest man's 11-year-old land claim. Might not work, Otis agreed, but it's gonna cost you a trip south to answer it in person, and it's gonna cost you time you'd rather be spending up here with your family, and Hale knows both of those things full well. Man can't hurt you directly no more, not with half the territory looking for him and a federal warrant on his head. So he's trying to hurt you the only way that's left to him, making your life difficult from wherever he's hiding. Ethan looked around the cabin at the mantel where Clara's wooden bird sat at the little bed in the corner that had once been Sarah's and Daniel's, and was now again filled every night with a child's small sleeping shape, at Clara herself, standing there with her chin already lifting in that particular way. She had the same fierce readiness she'd carried into Silver Creek's yard against a man with a gun to her daughter's head. Then I'll answer it, Ethan said. Whatever it takes. This is our home. I ain't letting a coward's lawyers take it from 3 states away, any more than I let his guns take Lily out of that camp. Clara stepped closer, took his hand. We'll answer it, she corrected gently. Together. Same as everything else. The trip south took the better part of 2 weeks, and Ethan hated every mile of it that put distance between himself and the mountain. But Clara had insisted on coming, and Lily had insisted on not being left behind either. And in the end, the three of them made the journey together. Clara's 11-year-old land deed folded careful in Ethan's saddlebag alongside sworn statements Marshal Coyle had personally provided, detailing Hale's fraud in language precise enough to leave no room for a judge's doubt. The courtroom, when they finally reached it, was smaller and less imposing than Ethan had braced himself for. A plain, wood-paneled room with a tired-looking judge who'd clearly heard more than his share of land disputes complicated by the railroad survey chaos sweeping the territory that year. Hale's lawyer, a thin, nervous man who seemed acutely aware his client's continued absence, did his case no favors. Argued for the better part of an hour about boundary lines and survey discrepancies, and a supposed prior claim that when pressed, he couldn't actually produce any paper for. Clara watched it all with the same sharp, patient attention she'd brought to that ledger book in Hale's office shack, and when the judge finally turned to her curious about the woman sitting so composed and certain beside the defendant, she didn't wait to be formally invited to speak. "Your Honor, if I may," she said, standing. "I've had occasion to study Mr. Hale's business dealings rather extensively in recent months. I'd be happy to walk the court through the pattern by which land near that railroad survey line has changed hands under circumstances that don't bear close examination, including, I should mention, the parcel currently in dispute, which according to county records was surveyed and registered a full 4 years before Mr. Hale's company began operating anywhere near this territory." The judge's eyebrows rose. Hale's lawyer's face went pale. It took less than 20 more minutes for the judge to dismiss the countersuit entirely, with language sharp enough about vexatious litigation by an absent fugitive, that even the thin lawyer seemed relieved to have the whole matter behind him. Outside the courthouse, Ethan let out a long breath. He felt like he'd been holding the entire 2 weeks south. "That's done then," he said. "Truly done. Truly done," Clara confirmed, and there was something fierce and satisfied in her voice. A woman who had once been sold across a saloon bar for $20, now standing on courthouse steps, having just dismantled with nothing but careful memory and sharp intelligence the last legal threat a wealthy fugitive could throw at the family she'd fought so hard to build. "You're something else, Clara Whitfield," Ethan said, looking at her with an expression that had nothing to do with the courtroom at all. "So are you Ethan Calloway?" she said, and something warm passed between them that had Lily tugging impatiently at both their hands, demanding to know when they were finally going to head home. The ride back to the mountain felt different than any journey Ethan had made in 20 years. Not a retreat from the world this time, but a return to something he'd built inside it, deliberately with people who'd chosen to build it alongside him. They reached Bird's Rest as the last week of spring gave way properly into summer wildflowers, pushing up thick and unruly along the trail. And that first night home after Lily had finally worn herself out enough to sleep, Ethan found Clara sitting outside on the porch step he'd built the autumn before, looking out at the darkening tree line with an expression he'd come to recognize as her thinking hard face. "Something on your mind," he said, settling beside her. "I've been thinking about names," Clara said. "About Lily's specifically." She glanced at him. "Legally, she's still listed under my late husband's name, and under the false guardianship papers Hale's people forged. I want that fixed properly once and for all. I want her name to reflect the family she actually has, now not the ones who sold her or the ones who claimed her falsely." Ethan went very still, understanding exactly where this was heading and not quite daring to hope it landed where he thought it might. "What are you saying, Clara?" "I'm saying," Clara said, turning to face him fully, "that I love you. That Lily loves you and has for months now, longer than either of us maybe let ourselves admit out loud. And I'm saying that if you'll have us properly, not just as two people who chose to stay on your mountain, but as your wife and your daughter in every way, the law and the church and this whole territory recognizes, then I'd very much like to stop waiting for you to work up the nerve to ask me and just ask you myself." Ethan stared at her a long moment, something enormous moving behind his weathered face. "Clara Whitfield," he said, finally, voice rough. "Are you proposing to me?" "I believe I am," Clara said, chin lifted, though a nervous smile had crept in at the corners of her mouth despite the boldness of her posture. "Someone in this cabin's got to be brave enough to say the plain thing out loud, and you've spent 20 years being a man of very few words when it comes to matters of the heart." Ethan laughed that same rare full laugh that had become over the months less rare with every passing week, and reached for both her hands, holding them tight in his own scarred, weathered ones. "Yes," he said. "God help me, yes, Clara. I'd be honored, and I'd be the luckiest man in this territory to make you my wife and Lily my daughter, in every way that words ever meant anything to anybody." Clara's eyes filled, and this time when he kissed her the first time 3 months into a life already so entwined, it had never felt necessary to rush toward it. It felt less like a beginning than like something that had already been true for a long while, finally being spoken plainly enough for both of them to hear. They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony that gathered nearly the whole of Black Hollow and half the ranchers from the valleys around Silver Creek, all of them people whose lives had been touched one way or another by the events of that winter. Otis stood as witness, beaming behind his usual gruff composure. Amos Reeves rode 2 days to attend cleaned up and steady in a way that bore no resemblance to the ragged, terrified man who'd stumbled onto their trail that first cold morning south. The Hendersons came bringing with them a girl who had over the months finally found her voice again and who sat close beside Lily throughout the whole ceremony, the two of them whispering and giggling in the particular unguarded way of children who'd survived something together and come out the other side able to be simply children again. Lily stood at the front beside her mother, solemn and proud, in a new dress Clara had sewn for the occasion, and when the moment came for her to present the small ring Ethan had commissioned from a silversmith in Black Hollow, simple, unadorned, exactly right. For a woman who'd spent 2 years being valued at $20 and deserved now to understand her worth, had never once had a price tag on it at all. Lily held it out with both hands, like she was presenting the crown jewels of some faraway kingdom. "Now you're really my pa," she announced to the gathered crowd once the vows had been spoken, drawing warm laughter from every corner of the yard. "Official and everything." "Official and everything," Ethan agreed, lifting her onto his hip without breaking stride. Clara laughing beside him with a joy so complete, it seemed to light the whole gathering from somewhere inside her. The following year brought its own share of hard news, mixed in with the good, the way years always did. Grissom's trial concluded that Autumn, the man's testimony against Hale's operation, detailed enough once he understood cooperation was his only path to a lighter sentence, to bring formal federal fraud charges against nearly a dozen associates who'd helped Hale forge deeds and launder stolen land through shell purchases along the railroad line. Hale himself remained a fugitive, last reported somewhere in the Nevada territories under an assumed name, but the federal warrant followed him everywhere he tried to settle. And word eventually came nearly 2 years later, secondhand through territorial newspapers, that he'd been arrested attempting to run a similar scheme in a mining town outside Virginia City, recognized by a deputy who'd once read a wanted poster carrying his description. "Justice caught up to him," Clara said, reading the newspaper account aloud by the fire, Lily curled against her side. "Even if it took its time getting there." "Justice mostly does," Ethan said. "Takes its time, but it tends to find its way home eventually, same as anybody with something worth findin'." There were harder losses too, the kind that came with any life lived fully, rather than protected behind mountain solitude, a difficult winter that took 2 of their small herd of cattle before spring thaw. A fever that swept through Black Hollow and had Ethan sitting up 3 straight nights beside Lily's bed with a wet cloth and a prayer he hadn't spoken in years, terrified in a way that dredged up every raw memory of Sarah and Daniel, until the fever finally broke on the 4th morning and Lily woke asking with the particular indignant confusion of a recovering child why everybody looked so tired and sad when she felt perfectly fine. "Never," Ethan told Clara that night, both of them still shaking with relief. "Never in my whole life do I want to feel that kind of fear again." "But you did," Clara said gently. "You felt it, and you stayed anyway. You sat up with her 3 nights instead of running from what it might cost you to love her that much." She took his hand. "That's the whole of it, Ethan. That's what you taught me back at the very beginning, when I couldn't believe kindness came without a price. Love doesn't stop being worth the risk just because the risk is real. It's worth it precisely because the risk is real." Ethan pulled her close, understanding in his bones, something he'd spent 20 years running from, and had finally, through the accident of a saloon bar and $20, learned to accept, instead, that a life protected from all possible loss was not in fact a life at all. It was only a long, careful kind of dying dressed up as survival. The mountain filled over the following years with sounds Ethan had once believed permanently gone from his life. Lily grew tall and stubborn and sharp-tongued in exactly the ways her mother had promised, taking to horses with an instinct that had ranchers 3 valleys over asking by the time she was 10 whether the girl might consider breaking colts for hire. She kept the small wooden bird her father had carved, now joined on the mantel by others she'd whittled herself, each one a little less lopsided than the last. Each one a quiet testament to a girl who had once been small and frightened in a mining tunnel and had grown instead into someone entirely her own. 2 years after the wedding, Clara found herself pregnant, and the news arrived in their small cabin with a quiet, disbelieving joy that took both of them several days to fully accept as real. "Another one," Ethan said, still marveling at it weeks later, watching Clara's hands rest against the small, still subtle curve of her stomach. "Never thought I'd get a second chance at any of this. Not after Daniel." "This isn't a second chance replacing what you lost," Clara said, gently understanding, as she always seemed, to the particular shape of the grief still living quietly alongside his joy. "This is a new chapter altogether. Daniel will always be your son, same as Sarah will always have been your wife. This baby doesn't erase any of that. It just means there's more love in this house than there used to be, not less grief for what came before." Ethan pressed his forehead gently against hers throat, too tight for words, and understood that he had married a woman who somehow always knew exactly the words his own heart couldn't quite find on its own. Their son was born the following spring, a fierce, loud, red-faced boy they named Daniel Otis Calloway. Daniel for the son Ethan had lost Otis for the barkeep, who'd ridden with a rifle to stand beside strangers in a mining camp yard, rather than stay silent about what he knew was wrong. Lily, 12 years old by then, and every bit as protective of her small brother as she'd once been, fiercely defended herself. Appointed herself his primary guardian within the first hour of his life, informing anyone who'd listen that she intended to teach him to fish, to track and to whittle in that exact order the moment he was old enough to hold anything steady in his small hands. "He's got Pa's frown already," she announced solemnly, peering into the cradle. "Look at him, judging everybody in the room already." "That's just what babies look like," Clara said, laughing despite her exhaustion. "Give it a few weeks before you start assigning him personality traits." But Lily wasn't wrong. Not really. Little Daniel grew into a serious, watchful child, quick to laugh once you'd earned it, but careful and deliberate in everything he did. And Ethan found himself more than once watching his small son study some new task with an intensity that reminded him powerfully of Sarah, of a boy he'd buried 9 years before. This new one was ever born, and understood that grief and joy really could live comfortably side by side in the same weathered heart, exactly as Clara had promised him they could. Bird's Rest grew too over those years, a second room added to the original cabin the summer Daniel turned 2, a proper barn built with the help of half of Black Hollow's ranchers, all of them repaying in whatever way they could. A debt of gratitude that had never once been formally asked for, but was freely given anyway, year after year, in the particular quiet currency of a frontier community that remembered exactly who had stood up when standing up cost something real. Clara, for her part, became something of a local legend in her own right, the woman who'd read a fraudulent ledger cold in a mining camp office, and dismantled an empire built on forged signatures with nothing but memory and sharp arithmetic. Families still traveled from neighboring valleys years later, asking her to review deeds and contracts they didn't quite trust, and she never once turned a worried rancher's wife away, understanding better than almost anyone in the territory exactly what it cost a person to be taken advantage of by someone who assumed they'd never notice. "You could charge for that, you know," Ethan told her once, watching her pore over a neighbor's water rights claim by lamplight, brow furrowed in the exact way it furrowed over her own ledgers. "I know," Clara said, not looking up. "I don't want to. Some kinds of help shouldn't have a price tag on them. I learned that lesson myself the hard way once upon a time in a saloon that smelled like whiskey and cruelty." Ethan crossed the room and pressed a kiss to the top of her head. understanding, as he often did in these quiet, ordinary moments, that the woman he'd bought out of that saloon for $20 had never once in all the years since needed rescuing at all. She had simply needed a door held open long enough for her to walk through it on her own 2 feet. And everything that had happened since the marriage, the children, the mountain filled with laughter, where silence had lived for 2 decades, had all grown from that single simple truth. By the time Lily turned 16, the wooden cabin that had once held only a grieving widower and his rifle had become something closer to the heart of the whole mountain community. A gathering place for holidays, a schoolroom, some winters. When the weather made travel to Black Hollow too dangerous for the youngest children, a home so thoroughly filled with warmth and noise and love that Ethan sometimes found himself standing in the doorway at the end of a long day, simply looking at it, marveling that this had ever been the same silent, empty structure he'd built with his own hands, as a monument to isolation rather than connection. "You're doing that thing again," Clara said one evening, finding him standing there watching Lily teach Daniel to whittle at the table while the fire crackled warm behind them both. "Staring at your own house like you can't quite believe it's real." "Can't," Ethan admitted. 20 years I told myself this kind of life wasn't for men like me. Told myself the mountain was safer empty than full on account of everything you let yourself love, you eventually gotta bury. He looked at her at the years etched gently into her face. Now laugh lines, instead of fear lines. A woman entirely transformed from the bruised, guarded stranger he'd bought out of a saloon bar so long ago. "Turns out I had it backward the whole time. Turns out an empty life ain't safer at all. It's just quieter while it's endin'." Clara took his hand, lacing her fingers through his, the same steady way she had that very first cold night on the ridge above Silver Creek when neither of them had yet dared to name what was growing between them. $20, she said softly, looking out at their children, at the fire, at the whole warm, noisy, impossible life they'd built together out of a single desperate act of decency in a cruel saloon. That's what Caleb decided I was worth that night. $20 and nothing more. Man was wrong about a great many things, Ethan said, but he was never more wrong than that. $20 didn't buy your worth, Clara. Wasn't never enough to buy that, and never could have been. What it bought was a door out of that room. Everything that came after this cabin, these children, this whole life we built, that's not something $20 purchased. That's something you built yourself, one impossible, courageous day at a time. And I've just had the honor of standing beside you while you did it. Clara turned into him, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of a heart that had once believed itself permanently closed off from this kind of ordinary, extraordinary happiness. "We should tell them the whole story someday," she said. "Lily and Daniel both. All of it. The saloon, the $20, Silver Creek, everything we survived to get here. We will," Ethan said. "When they're old enough to understand it proper. Not as some grim tale to frighten them, but as proof of something true, that even the worst nights don't get the final say in how a story ends. That a person sold for $20 in a saloon can end up owning the whole of her own life. Instead, if she's got the courage to keep fighting for it, and somebody willing to stand beside her while she does." Outside, the mountain settled into evening, the way it had 10,000 evenings before snow-capped peaks, catching the last gold light of a day. Well spent, the same wilderness that had once been Ethan Calloway's only companion, now home to a family that had grown against every hard lesson his younger self had ever learned about the dangers of loving something you could lose into something unshakably, permanently whole. Ethan Calloway had spent 20 years believing that solitude was the only honest way to survive a cruel world, that a man who let nobody close could never again be broken by loss, the way losing Sarah and Daniel had once broken him. He had been wrong about that, as it turned out wrong in the deepest, most fortunate way a man could possibly be wrong. The girl he had bought for $20 in a saloon that smelled of whiskey and cruelty had not needed saving after all. She had simply needed one honest door held open, one promise kept without condition. One man willing to stand beside her instead of deciding on her behalf what her life was worth. And in return, without ever meaning to, without ever asking for it, she had given him back everything the mountain's long silence had once convinced him. He'd lost forever a home filled with laughter instead of grief. children who called him Pa, with unguarded certainty, a wife who had taught him that love was never truly the risk his fear had made it out to be, but the only thing in this hard, unforgiving territory ever actually worth the risking. The $20 Ethan Calloway had spent that long-ago winter night in Black Hollow had never bought him a wife, or a family, or a home at the top of a mountain filled with more warmth than he'd believed the world still had left to give a man like him. It had bought him simply and completely the chance to become human again, and everything he had built since one hard-won, ordinary, extraordinary day at a time had been entirely, unmistakably his own.